燃え上がれガンダム。Hello and welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at Japanimation Station. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we have been blessed. We have been blessed here at Weekly Suit Gundam with more Gundam, and so we're going to talk about it because we have now finished here the Witch from Mercury, Mobile Suit Gundam Witch from Mercury, or Suisei no Majo, as it's called in Japanese. That has finished its second and presumably final season. We did an episode on the prologue. We did an episode on season 1. If people haven't heard those, they can go back and check those out. So this episode is going to be all about season 2 of Witch from Mercury. Obviously, we'll also talk about the show as a whole, looking back on the whole project. But yeah, Witch from Mercury is finished, and that was a good fucking Gundam. I've been watching it all week to week, basically, and so then I rewatched the whole thing through in this last week to prepare for this podcast, and I really like this fucking show.
Awesome. I like it too. I have a couple of reservations that I want to talk through and work out. I'm very excited to record this because, to be clear, my overall reaction is this is a very, very good show. Just with, like I said, some reservations that make me want to talk about it with you here on the show. So that should be fun. Obviously, spoilers for season 2 of Witch from Mercury. For those who haven't seen it yet, go watch it. Yeah, you were watching it week to week. I wound up just because, not because of any antipathy towards the show, but just busyness with other stuff, and I didn't think I could focus on it. I did not watch it week to week, and I didn't get anything spoiled. I also was using Twitter a lot less over these last couple months, so I think I just wasn't following spaces online where people were talking about it. But yeah, so then I finally watched it this week. So you've seen this season twice. I saw season 1 once because I did the same thing with season 1 where I watched it week to week and then went back and did a whole rewatch before the podcast. This time I've just seen it the one time through to talk about it for the podcast. Yeah, like I said, enjoyed it with a couple of reservations that we can get into here if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I love this show. Just like to put my full cards on the table. I love it even more after rewatching it all the way through. And I think I probably know what some of your reservations are. And I've seen some, like certain groups have somewhat mixed reaction to some things about season 2. But overall, I really love, especially season 2. I think I like season 2 more than season 1. And there's something about like the shape of the show I really enjoy. It is like the first time an AU Gundam has ever like done some of the stuff that Tomino does with his Gundams, particularly in terms of like space, like pacing and the way that like the show's ability to find, like, to have every episode be able to do so many different things so effectively. This season was, I think, far more fun to watch week to week on, like, in terms of the episodes themselves. So I talked about on the last time we did Witch from Mercury, one of the main things I enjoyed about watching the show weekly was less the, like, oh, I, get a little piece of Witch from Mercury every week, and it was more, oh, I get to follow along with the fan reaction, I get to, like, do the fan art stuff, the Yamada Dojin, really adorable Tanuki Sleda little comics, which he has continued to do, that those are still adorable. There's a volume 2 and 3 of those that he's selling in the next Comic Cat. I'm still jealous that I can't go to Japan and just go buy those because they're great. And then also the like radio / podcast that they do, hosted by the Sleda and Miorine's voice actors that go into the show and have had guest stars throughout this whole season, especially with a bunch of the other people like Hana Natsuki from the show. And so I've enjoyed like that sort of experience of being able to follow the show. But season 2, I think each episode is so packed, like so much happens. And I think it's like such a rewarding show on that way that reminds me a lot of like the last half or so of Zeta Gundam is probably something that feels to me like is a touchstone for what Suisei Namajo is trying, or Witch From Mercury is trying to do, is like really sort of just no, there's no wasted space in anything in season 2. And there's something about that I just really loved and made it, especially on a rewatch, very rewarding to see how thoughtful and deliberate so many things were. And that like so much of what happens in the last 2 or 3 episodes is intentionally set up in a lot of different ways in those early episodes. And you can really clearly see the like whole arc and how planned out it was. But yeah, I love this show. And the biggest thing I love about it is the characters, which I think top to bottom, it's got the best characters of like any anime. I don't know, like every person in the show, by the time you get to the end, there's no character that feels like they weren't there for a reason. There's no character that doesn't feel like they grew or changed or were interesting. Like every single person on the show, whether it's like Cecilia, the sassy girl who runs the duel committee, or it's Soletta, the main character of the show, every one of them feels like they had like really interesting stuff. And that have really striking character designs and grew and evolved over the course of the show. And that I think is like amazing to me. And it's probably my favorite part of the show is just how they write the characters and what they do with them. But yes, I love Witch From Mercury, if that is not clear.
Yeah, and I'm glad you love it. And I think I am maybe one notch below, like, full-blown loving it, but I really, really like it. And I want to be clear, whatever I'm going to say, I want to stipulate I think this is, like, a really, really good show. I think it has remarkable animation, particularly in this second season. Like, as good as it was in the first season, the second season even gets crazier with the credits list. I fucking love, you'll get to at the end of some episodes, and it'll have 7 storyboarders and 6 directors, and it's like, I've never seen that in an episode of television. It's just nuts, but like you can see why. It's very well animated, particularly just like the characters and the mobile suits. It's out of this world sometimes. I think the soundtrack is up to the crazy high Gundam standards, so much so that I actually this morning pre-ordered the soundtrack is coming out in Japan later this month, and I did an order of that and the Final Fantasy 16 soundtrack so I can get both of those in, and should probably share those with you, Sean, because the music is so fucking good, and I'm excited to get the full version of all of it, because especially the last couple episodes of Witch From Mercury have just fucking banger after banger of soundtrack. I agree with you about the characters. I think they're great. I think the cast of this thing is off the charts. The voice acting is so good. The plotting is very tight. The moment-to-moment writing is excellent. I love all of that. I have this lingering sense of just very minor underwhelm in that I think my reaction to the first season was I thought, oh, this feels like the most different mainline Gundam series other than G Gundam. It is, it is so changing where we are in the world. Now we're at a school. It's, our first female protagonist. It's our first sort of, LGBTQ sort of relationship in the story. There's so many things that make Witch From Mercury Season 1 feel different. And then it kind of links up and feels more traditionally Gundam at the end of that season. And Season 2 sort of doubles down on that. And it is like Season 2 goes into what basically every AU Gundam does at some point and is reconfiguring a lot of the iconography and the scenarios of classic Gundam. On the iconography level, you have things like the fencing match near the end that is a fun nod to the end of the original Gundam. And then, in terms of the storytelling, you have a lot of your traditional Gundam stuff. You have your Cyber New type characters, you have your big psychic super weapon, you have your giant space laser, you have the very Tomino thing of having so many political factions on screen warring for supremacy you can't keep them straight at all times, which, to be clear, I think is a feature, not a bug.
Yes.
But because it is doing all of that in a package that is half the length of any other mainline Gundam show, it does just feel a little thin at the end to me, where, like, I don't know if I feel, and maybe I would feel differently on a second viewing, that we fully exploited the potential of what a unique story and setting and world and set of characters the first season laid out, where this season just felt a little less unique to me than the first season did. And I love how kind of deliberately paced that first season was. I think this season you're correct in that every episode is jam-packed. Sometimes I wanted to slow down, and I wanted to have a little bit more with some characters. And I got to the end, and I would feel like some characters, their arc was finished, but I wanted more with them in some places. There are parts of the final episodes that feel like a extremely well-done version of a Gundam Greatest Hits album to me a little bit. And I wonder if there's a longer version of this show that engages with the same iconography and narrative archetypes, but has more time to stretch the legs of really what makes it unique and comes out feeling a little more singular. And I will say, I made a single comment on G-Witch on Twitter. I just said I was announcing that we were doing this podcast, and I said, hey, this show was pretty good, wasn't it? And I said, and we're going to podcast on it. And every comment I've gotten on that tweet, all of which are from regular Weekly Suit Gundam listeners, was basically this point, was feeling like the series was a little rushed, feeling it was longer, while still liking it. I haven't seen anyone out there being like, G-Witch sucked. You'd have to be a real fucking grump to think G-Witch sucked. But I have seen this complaint, and I kind of wanted to talk through it with you, Sean.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things is, while it is using all that Gundam iconography, what the show fundamentally is doing near the end, and we're kind of jumping to the end here, but like, it's dismantling all of that, right? It's about breaking the Gundam curse for these people, both in terms of like literally in the show, but also metaphorically, right? Like the big moment, because the big thing that differentiates this show in the last 2 episodes, nobody dies. Nobody dies at the end of this. And that's like, and the last thing the show leaves you with is like, may all the blessings find you, right? It's quoting the Shikufuku, the opening theme from season 1.
Well, and can I even say something on that?
Yeah.
We had a little section at the end of our season 1 podcast where we predicted who all was going to die. And my plan was to go through that and we would check through it. We don't need to. Almost no one did. The only characters who did are Sophie and Norea. And even then, you can argue that death means something different in this world. And it's just not worth revisiting that conversation because it turns out... And I do think this is interesting. This show has just a fundamentally different viewpoint. It is like the anti-Iron-Blooded Orphans.
Yeah, and it's specifically, there's the moment where you have, like, the most Gundam thing that happens in the show in some way, which is Guel and Lauda fighting, right? Like, Lauda, like, sort of loses his mind after all this bullshit that's happened. He gets into a Gundam. He has to fight Guel. Guel does the thing of where he says, like, you know, don't, like, where he seemingly sacrifices himself, like, just don't go right, like, piloting Gundams anymore. And you think that they're both, that Guel is going to die, and then Felshi, secret MVP of Witch From Mercury, flies in with basically a mobile suit space fire extinguisher, like, patches up their mobile suits, prevents the thing from blowing up, and just says, what the fuck are you doing? You idiots! Like, what you're gonna, like, these you two brothers are going to kill each other? Like, if that's a joke, that's not funny. And then Guel says to himself, like, yeah, that's not funny. And that to me is the moment where, like, it sort of clicks into place of the show, that there's something about, like, the optimism of the show and the hope of the show of saying it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. That dismantling the Gundam curse for these people is about, like, having these kids live and learning from the mistakes of the people that came before them. And it's almost like a little bit G-Reco-esque in that way, with how hopeful it is at the end, with how positive it is. And that to me is, like, fundamentally, I think what the show is doing with some of that Gundam iconography is about breaking it down. Like, it's literally breaking it down, right? Like, literally the Gundams and the, like, Albawaku equivalent, like the giant space fortress, which is at the end of every Gundam show has to have a giant space fortress. All that shit is disintegrated. The Benerit corporation is disintegrated, and its properties are distributed to the Earth. And, like, I like that the show at the end is about all this new generation of people taking a look at the giant bag of, like, rancid dog shit that's been handed to them by the adults of this world, and they say, no, fuck this shit, and they throw it away and move on. And they say, like, we don't need any of that. Like, let that go. Like, just let all that go. Let it be disintegrated. Turn it to dust. And let's, like, move forward to try to find a better world. And that, to me, is, like, what I found very affecting about the show. And I think that message is, like, throughout the entire series. And so it's like, it is very much playing with a lot of Gundam iconography, but it is, I think, incredibly canny and very thoughtful about how it is using that Gundam iconography to tell a different kind of Gundam story, to tell a Gundam story where you don't have to have every single character die, and that there's more hope and more power found in these characters living than Sleta giving her life at the end, you know?
Yeah, and I think this is... I agree with all this, and I think this is where I want to see the show again. I'm excited for it to come out on Blu-ray and just watch it in, like, super nice, high-definition quality. I will probably wait for that to watch it again, because this is definitely a show that I think is going to benefit from that. It looks fine on Crunchyroll, but, you know, it's such a nicely animated show, and there's some really, like, heavy motion stuff going on at the end, which is where streaming services can sometimes suffer. So I'm excited to watch it again, because I do think, like, I love all the notes it hits at the end. And that moment that you're talking about with Gwell and Lauda, I have it in my notes here. It is to me like probably the Rosetta Stone moment of this entire series.
Yeah.
Because it is the most, it's funny because in the lead up to that moment, I went, boy, this came out of nowhere. Because Lauda is, if you seriously wanted to play that moment and have Gwell die, it is not earned, right? Because Lauda there has not been enough time with Lauda as a character to like build all of this, right? But it's very touching, and what that moment is ultimately about is Gwell being a good brother and like his fundamental goodness. And then because it is not about him dying, and it is undercut with, you fucking idiots, you're fine, go live. It is sometimes harder to live than to die. Be heroes and go live, right? And they're able to do that. And I do like that moment. And then I think the dual climax of having Miorine dissolve the Benerit group to take away the Space Assembly League's reason to attack them, and then having Suletta do all of her crazy new type shit to her like crazy rainbow new type shit, which does not feel accidental, to, disassemble the space laser and the Abaku style, Quiet Zero Fortress and all of that. It's extremely smart, and I think it's like very pointedly and well delivered. And so I liked all of that. And I do think like probably, almost certainly, if I watch it again, I would feel it click into place a little more, knowing how confidently it closes. The pace would feel like very, very confident and self-assured to me. It is a little different. I mean, we have not seen, other than G-Reco, which is a crazy other kind of thing, we have not seen a mainline Gundam show try to do a full AU world-building story in 25 episodes. Just hasn't been done, right? And even with G-Reco, it's hard to say that it did it in 26, because really it's kind of 50, but in 26, right?
Yeah.
So it is just a different kind of thing. And I think some of that is just adjusting that the rhythms of this show are a little different, but some of that is like the show has adjusted itself. Its stakes are also different. It is never to the level of some of the stuff that happens in other Gundam shows. I guess if Quiet Zero was fully unleashed, it would be very bad, but also Quiet Zero is easier to kind of like disassemble. Even before, I don't mean even the literal disassembly at the particle level that Suletta does, but just like they have to enter the right passcode and do all of that, right? The stakes are just a little different, which befits a show that is shorter. And, I think, again, I'm presenting my quote-unquote complaints, not fully sure of them, because it's something I'm still kind of sorting out. I completely understand the feeling of, man, I love these characters and I love this world and I wish there was more of it. And that's a good thing. And I'm kind of, I think everyone that I saw on Twitter talking to me about this was in a similar place of feeling like, I guess I'm not sure. Was it that they left you wanting more in the right way? Or is it like, oh man, I just want to spend more time in this world? And that can be both a good and a bad thing,
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely like they leave you wanting more. Like, I want to see more of these characters. I love this world. I love this show. But this story feels very complete. Because I don't know, like, outside of there's, like, a handful of things of, like, probably the biggest thing that, like, I wish the show had time to do is to have a bigger moment with Delling and Miorine near the end. Like, there's a little bit of a moment with them when he wakes up for the first time. And you see him, like, you basically see him in, like, a news footage in the epilogue, but you don't, like, really get to visit that character. That, to me, is probably the only major thing. Maybe, like, a little bit of it would have been nice to hit up some of the Donna Fold characters in a bigger way at the end. That, like, if the last episode was able to be, like, 10 minutes longer, you could have fit, I think, like, some more stuff in there, and that would be good. But that stuff's also not essential. But other than that, like, I don't know what I would actually want. Like, I don't know what, if you gave me 12 more episodes of Witch from Mercury, I don't know what you would do with it, because what else would you need to do? Like, it's just like, this is the story. Like, the story's so well told and it feels so intentional. Like, it's down to the season 1, season 2 split is so intentional and it's so thoughtful of what they are doing, where season 2 is a fundamentally different beast than season 1. And it is about, like, sort of initially making you think that this was going to be similar to season 1 in the first episode, and then in the second episode of season 2 saying, like, nope, this is a fundamentally different world. You cannot go back to the status quo from season 1. That status quo has been shattered and is completely irreparable. And so there is such an intentionality to the story being told here that like I understand the sentiment of people wanting more, but when I think about like practically what would that actually be outside of having like a couple of extra scenes here and there that are the sorts of things that if they made a compilation movie, they might like put a scene like, that would be like the extra scene they add in. Outside of that, like I actually don't know what else you would do with this story, what else you would put in there, where else you would go with it.
Yeah, and I think when people are saying that, to be clear, and I don't think you're saying this, they're not saying like, I want 12 more from where we left off, right? It's not necessarily. Yeah. It's more like, I wish we had taken longer along the way, and I can get that in places, but usually I think I come back to what you're saying, Sean, where there are some characters or plot beats where I'm like, oh man, I loved this character so much that I wish we had a little bit more with them in this spot. And then I think about it and I go, but I don't know if that would actually be the best use of them. Like, I actually, like, for instance, one of my favorite characters in Season 2 is our new version of Elan, who is the Hanai Natsuki character.
Yes.
How many characters does he voice in this? It's like 2 or 3 versions? 3? Okay.
Yes, because you have Ellen Prime, or the original Ellen, you've got Ellen number 4, you've got Ellen number 5. I'm just going to say that, like, so, because I have listened to, like, the radio show and a lot of the live streams they've done, which are all in Japanese. Like, in the Japanese sphere, they refer to those Ellen characters. Number 4 is Yongo, which just means number 4, and then number 5 is Gogo, which is number 5. And to me, he is just Gogo. Like, that is just what Ellen 5 is, so that is just how I'm going to refer to that character, so people know, just because to me that is what that character's name is. But yes, Hanai Natsuki plays 3 characters, and in fact, they did a live stream in this is how big this show is, just for people to know. Witch from Mercury is like massively fucking huge in Japan. And has like ballooned the sales of Gunpla in Japan and around the world, just like hugely popular. So popular that they did like a 90-minute long live stream following the ending of the airing of the final episode with Ichinose Kana, the voice actress for Letta, Lin, the voice actress for Miodine, and then it's the guy who plays Lauda was there, and the guy who plays Guel was supposed to be there, but he couldn't make it. But they had all of them there, and then they also read some statements from some of the other cast members that couldn't be there, including Hanai Natsuki, and he opens his letter with like, "Hello everyone, I'm Hanai Natsuki, the actor who plays Ellen and Ellen and Ellen in Witch from Mercury," and it's very good.
Yes. But anyway, we will talk about Ellen and Natsuki's role much more later, Hanai Natsuki's role much more later, because it's great. But what I was going to say is that, like, I love that character, and there are moments where, like, there was this gut instinct for me of, like, oh, man, I want to spend more time with him. Like, after Norea dies, and he's all torn up, and he flies away, we don't see him again until I think he is, like, hanging out outside the house where everyone else is chilling, and he's just, like, sitting there, like, eating an apple against the wall and, like, listening in on them, and I'm like, oh, man, I kind of feel like in a 50-episode version of this, we probably would have gotten, like, 2 or 3 episodes of Elan out on his, like, long walkabout of the soul and seeing that, and I'm like, that could be cool. But then I think about it and I go, but I don't think that's the character they wrote. I think the character they wrote actually works very well in this place, and I think all of his big moments land so hard without me having 5 Elan-centric episodes. Like, he's the one who fires the bullet that doesn't kill Prospera but stops her in the moment. Her helmet, in a very Char Aznable way, the helmet her dumb helmet saves her life, and then she's okay. We'll talk about her. Oh my god. So, like, yeah, I think that's the point maybe I keep coming back to is, okay, maybe I wanted more here and here, but then I think about it and I go, but we didn't necessarily need it, and there's obviously a danger to diluting the story if you drag it out too much.
That's how I feel about some of those criticisms. It's like a thing where I get where people are coming from, but when I think about, like, practically speaking, I think it would be a worse show. Like, I think if they spent way more time on that, I think it would dilute what the show is doing, because the show is, I think, very purposefully built this way. And that, like, because it's a thing the show constantly does, I think, is it kind of defies your expectations of how you think a certain sequence is going to go, because you think it's going to follow, like, certain Gundam tropes in a specific way, or like anime tropes in general. One of them being the, like, we have to have, like, a 3-episode arc where Soletta is depressed and devastated after what has happened with Miodine. And I love that it's like, she's obviously emotionally affected, but her life is not over because of the thing that happened with Miodine. And what hits her way harder is all the stuff that happens with Ellie afterwards and her finding out the clone stuff. But Soletta is able to, she's stronger than that. She's able to pick herself back up and get back into things in a way that is, I think, really empowering. I don't know. There's something about like that they don't often choose to sort of go and do the kind of cliche we have to have like this character be depressed forever and like really milk some of those emotional moments. The show's has such a pace that's like, no, we want to move on from that. Like we need to keep moving forward. And the reality is that like these people are strong, and they like have, and Ellen Gogo has like faced down death and lived with the reality of that mortality his whole life. The death of Noria is a huge thing that changes his perspective and it changes him as a person, but it's not something where he needs to have a giant 5-episode arc to go on a navel gazing exploration that shows you all that change. You know who Gogo is as a person. You've seen him. You understand his psychology, and so you can fill in all of the gaps between him seemingly flying out of the colony, which is really him like trying to find a way to sneak back into the colony because it's where the people wouldn't look for him, so he can like hide out, and him trying to figure out what he's going to do from this point on and eavesdropping in on their conversation. Like, you don't need an episode that tells you that story. You can fill that in on your own, and that to me is like the Tomino style. That's like what Gundam has been built on for so long, is like, you don't need to have like a big story arc in Gundam showing you Bright and Mirai getting closer and kind of starting a romantic relationship. You need a couple of scenes that indicate it, and everything else you can fill in because you understand who those people are on a really fundamental level. And Witch from Mercury to me is the only AU I can think of that is able to do that exact trick. It's like the only show I've seen that is not a Tomino show that is able to do that and do it so effectively.
Well, and another thing I was thinking about with this is, you know, one of the comments I read was someone saying, like, they were a little bummed out that it seems like we're probably at a point where we're never going to get a 50-episode Gundam show again. And they were saying just because of, like, production timelines. And production timelines are part of it. I actually think the bigger reason when I think about it is that it's a different skill set now. Like, the writer of Witch from Mercury is Ichiro Okochi, who is like one of the most accomplished writers of the 2000s. And he literally, his first gig is episodic screenplays on Turn A Gundam. So when you say he knows the Tomino thing, he's worked with Tomino extensively. He was also the writer of Overman King Gainer and stuff like that. So he's studied from that. But if you look at the shows where he has done series composition, he's never written a 50-episode show. The closest would be Code Geass. If you add it and its sequel series together, they come to 50, but they are individually 26-episode shows. And that is just, as anime has shifted, that's the skill set writers in 2023 have, is to write a tight 24 to 26 episode show, not necessarily a sprawling 50 episode show, which is just a fundamentally different skill set. And that's not to say one is better or worse. You know, Iron-Blooded Orphans, Mario could have knocked that out of the fucking park at 50 episodes, and I don't think you could tell that show in 24. But this is a show that does feel like it was from the ground up. The muscles that were used to write it were to write a kind of smaller, tighter 26-episode show. And I think, especially the more we talk about it, the more I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing or a thing to be afraid of in the changing anime landscape.
Yeah, and you know, and I think that person commenting that is probably right. Like, I wouldn't necessarily expect us to get a 50-episode Gundam show. No, I think it is entirely possible that they do a Zeta Gundam for Witch from Mercury.
Right.
Like, I don't think that's like off the table. The show is popular enough. They're going to exploit Witch from Mercury. If people are worried there's not going to be more Witch from Mercury content, don't worry. There will be more Witch from Mercury content. Whether that takes the form of a big TV show, whether it's a movie, or whether it's just like 1,000 manga and light novel spin-offs. I mean, there's already a manga spin-off that they've already started making. So it's like, you don't need to worry about that. If you want that, you can. Like, you can play the new Super Robot Wars game that is going to feature Sleda extensively because of how popular Witch from Mercury is. So it's like, that's going to be out there. But the nature of like the anime industry is that it is moved so far away from like the 50-episode show. It's been a long time. Like, Double O Gundam and Iron-Blooded Orphans are already weird for them going for that, and obviously they had to go for that by splitting them up into two core arcs, because doing a 4-core thing is just unusual. You don't do it outside of like your One Pieces or Sazai-san and Doraemon and that kind of stuff that just has like legacy shows that have inherited that fundamental structure. You just don't do the 1 year continuous show thing anymore. And you know, that's something about that is a little bit sad, because it's sad for things to change and for time to move on and stuff like that. But that's also the nature of things. And there was stuff about the 50-episode shows that could get tedious, because sometimes they just had to fucking fill some episodes. You know, we had the Moon arcs in Double Zeta, and stuff like that. That those kinds of episodes exist. because they had 50 episodes to fill and the shows were designed to try to fill that, this show was designed very clearly to be a two-course show. Like from the beginning, from the ground up, this was meant to be a two-course show. And it was written that way, it was designed that way, it was thought of that way. And so like, it's so because of that, I just can't imagine what the 50 episode version of Witch from Mercury would be, because that show couldn't exist. It would be a fundamentally different project. And so the show, to me, just so like takes the form of what it wants to be, and I think it's so well designed within the shape that they have decided for it, / the shape that it could practically exist in, which is the same thing.
Right, and I think, to be clear, I don't think, and I don't think you think either, Sean, that like one is preferable to the other in terms of length of a show.
No.
There are things that a 50-episode Gundam can do that a 25-episode Gundam will never be able to do. There are also things that a 25-episode run of Gundam is able to do that a 50-episode Gundam can't do. And some of that, I think, with Witch from Mercury, is the kind of like lightness on its feet, the tightness, the general kind of propulsiveness it has in its second half. There's just, and I think there's thematic things. I think if you got to the end of a 50-episode Gundam and nobody died like this, that would feel weird in a different way, right? That would feel like you'd invested more time for lower stakes, and I don't know if that would work quite the same way. Even something like Turn A Gundam, which definitely has more minimal deaths in it near the end, has more of like world shifting on its axis stuff going on near the end, right? And Turn A Gundam has to be 50 for that reason. This, I think, and G-Reco probably is something I think it takes some cues from on that level, just in that G-Reco also recognizes that there's a lightness you can have at a shorter run that makes sense. And so, yeah, I think if my reaction was maybe some of it felt slightly thin to me, some of that I think is, and I think a lot of like long-term Gundam fans are probably going to encounter this, just you are recalibrating a little bit because this is a different beast of a show, and that's okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like, I texted my brother who hasn't seen this season yet, and I was like, you really need to watch this, because I'm actually super curious what you, Thomas, not a massive Gundam fan, would think of this, because I think I'm curious to hear from more people in my life who are not you, Sean, who has seen all of Gundam alongside me, because I think some of those issues actually probably just wouldn't even exist at all in that case.
Yeah, because it is notable, that Witch from Mercury has, like, it's popular both because, it's popular because it's really good. But that popularity both comes from attracting returning Gundam fans, but also attracting a lot of people who have never really gotten into Gundam before. And that's, like, one of the distinct pleasures. I think I talked about this last time, because it's true of the season 1 as well. But, I engage with a lot of Japanese media online, and I watch like VTuber live streams and stuff like that. And the amount of times I've seen Witch from Mercury pop up in places like that, totally sort of unprompted. This is not like a Gundam-focused stream. It's not a streamer who has ever mentioned Gundam ever. And then all of a sudden they make a reference to something that happened in Witch from Mercury and talk about it a little bit and how much they love the show. And it's like, that there's something incredibly gratifying about that, and I think it is because Witch from Mercury is so well designed to exist in the modern anime space. Like the aesthetic of the show, the writing of the show, the pacing and the style of the show, and like everything around the edges of like their like multimedia, like social media engagement and stuff like that. All of that is so canny and thought through and so well designed that this is like, to me, kind of like the sort of thing that Gundam has to become in order to survive in the modern anime world. Like this is like fits the kind of styles and aesthetics and preferences of a modern anime viewing audience that are not necessarily Gundam diehard fans, in a way that allows the popularity of Witch from Mercury and allows like the Gundam to attract a bigger audience, more people that haven't gotten into it before, demographics that sort of come and go with Gundam. Like this is another Gundam show that is really popular with a lot of women for like obvious reasons, both because it has a female protagonist, which is like a long needed change for the franchises, but then also all the dudes are really hot. There's no questioning that Gwell, Shattuck, and Ellen are 3 really hot dudes, and by the end of the show, they're all cool and interesting characters that all give you 3 different flavors of hot dude, right? Like you can so easily imagine the Otome game, like dating sim of Witch from Mercury, where you play some like comely but like very nice new student that goes to attend Asakashia Academy, and then you've got those three guys, and then I don't know, maybe you can throw Martin a bone, throw Martin in there. I don't know who's going to pick Martin.
Martin isn't as hot, but he would be emphatically the best boyfriend of all of those.
Yes, maybe you're like Martin's childhood friend. Maybe he can be the childhood friend character.
Yes.
That's how you got into the school. But like that, but you have a dating sim game, and like you have to like get with the different guys. Like it's just like some like the flavor and style of the show and like what it's going for, Witch From Mercury, is so different, and for Gundam is very radical in a lot of those places, and it naturally that it like attracts a different kind of audience here, which I find extremely satisfying. It's one of the reasons why following like the fan art scene online and stuff like that is so satisfying, is because it's attracting people that aren't necessarily Gundam people. Like, they're not making fan art that has a bunch of other Gundam references and stuff like that necessarily. Some of that does exist, but it's more just people falling in love with this show, falling in love with these characters and expressing that, whether it's like the Yuri side of it with Sleda and Miodine, or it's the like boys love thing with Ellen and Guel, or whatever character combination you want to make. Like, all of that is so ripe in this show because it's so just kind of made for this moment.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome. And, like, definitely the show that this reminds me of both on screen and, more importantly, off is Gundam Seed for that reason.
Yes.
Seed is the last time Gundam was this popular. Seed is the last Gundam show and kind of the first Gundam show that brought in a massive new audience, right? Mm-hmm. Everything before Seed was sort of a continuation in one form or another of what Gundam had been doing up to that point. And then you get Gundam Seed and you get this massive new, especially in Japan. Gundam Wing brought in its own audience overseas, but that's a different thing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting to compare this and Gundam Seed because they are also both coming at it. Like, they both have a pretty similar central thematic conceit, which is about that idea of kids being handed a shitty world and rejecting it, which to some degree is what every Gundam story is, but Seed and G-Witch are most devoted to that idea of completely dismantling that world, which I think is pretty cool. I think it's interesting the moments that those come out of, which is the early 2000s for Seed, which is after this like period of pretty heavy like economic devastation in Japan and a lot of like youthful discontent, and then that comes into Gundam Seed. And I think this is interesting in like a 2023 political context with a lot of like discussions of like, you know, nationalism and disarmament and all this kind of stuff.
And LGBT themes and stuff like that, and that being an ongoing issue in Japanese politics.
Right. So, you know, they're very interesting shows to, you know, compare in that regard. And it actually makes it interesting that Seed is having its revival at this moment. Uh-huh. I'm curious how those fandoms will overlap when they come out. I'm curious if, like, because actually I saw I was Googling G-Witch the other day because I wanted to see what have people written about this online. And one article I saw, someone was doing their, like, clickbait of, like, other Gundam shows to watch after G-Witch. And I'm like, Seed would probably be my first thing to recommend if someone didn't want to go, like, super on that, or, like, maybe Build Fighters. I was like, actually, I think a lot of people who like G-Witch would really like Build Fighters, because anyone would like Build Fighters. But, like, Seed would be another one if you wanted to do a big 50-episode Gundam. Like, you know, I think Iron-Blooded Orphans is great. I don't know if I would say that every G-Witch fan would be super into what IBO is doing, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. But no, they're interesting to compare in that regard. And yeah, the sheer popularity and like the extra cultural conversation is fascinating. And it's the cool thing that Gundam can do. Gundam can continually reinvent itself for new audiences. You know, I saw one site that has gotten on the Gundam bandwagon because they shamelessly chase the clickbait is Polygon. And often I make fun of Polygon headlines because they're terrible. They did have one piece when season 1 of G-Witch finished that I thought was pretty smart, which was saying they wished Star Wars would be more like Gundam, in the sense of like, how cool would it be if Star Wars would maybe like do the Gundam thing of having the original continuity and then just letting people do spin-offs that maybe use the iconography and the style, but none of the continuity. And I do think that would be amazing. Like, I was thinking that through the end of G-Witch, just like with how, because this has to be the best use of like the Char iconography in an AU Gundam, right? Yeah, with Prospera. And I was thinking, how cool would it be if someone could make a new Star Wars where they play with the Darth Vader iconography, but didn't have to do Darth Vader. And they didn't have to do the stupid thing the sequels did with Kylo Ren. It could just be like a Darth Vader clone, but like a Char clone, and like do something that playful. And Star Wars is always going to be trapped in its own continuity, and also that means its audience is always going to be somewhat self-selecting, even if it's very big. And it is the cool thing, and it's something G-Witch obviously exploits masterfully in the Gundam formula, is that you can reinvent as much as you want and do crazy new things while still having a really clear, tangible connection to Gundam. This is a Gundam-ass Gundam show in a lot of ways. And that's just so cool.
Yeah, it is like watching Witch From Mercury is just a thing that reminds you of why you're a fan of Gundam, because it is just one of those franchises that is so sort of self-restoring in that way, because it has built for a long time, like it has built in this mechanism that will allows it, like the audience accepts that you can have these different takes on Gundam. And like the only thing that connects it all is that there's going to be a Gundam in there, and there are lots of kind of narrative tropes and archetypes and things like that the show has available to play with however it chooses. But fundamentally, they can all kind of be their own thing, and you can be someone who watches Witch from Mercury, and that can be the only Gundam thing you watch, and you could be a giant, like, lifelong fan of Witch from Mercury, and have, like, get your, like, stands of all the different characters, and you go and you collect all the cards in the, like, collectible candies and shit like that, and get, like,
Get
stickers.
your choo-choo tattoo on your arm.
Yes, like, you can get all that stuff, and never touch another Gundam show, and Bandai's fine with that. Bandai gets his money from you just on Witch from Mercury, even if you're not, like, going everywhere else. And it is, as a capitalist pursuit, I think it's very canny, because it just means that, like, you always have another avenue by which you can make Gundam a big thing, but also just as, like, a fan that wants, like, cool anime, that is very satisfying, because it means that Witch from Mercury does not have to be beholden to other shit. It just gets to be what it wants to be.
Definitely, if Hollywood were in the lesson learning business, which they are not, they are in the run against a wall until we break our heads in half business. But if they were in the lesson learning business, as all of the large interconnected continuity mess franchises are clearly failing at the box office and on streaming, I would take a look at Witch from Mercury. I would take a look at, like, the Gundam model and go, hey, what if we did that? That could be cool, because it's exactly what you're saying. It's infinitely open to everybody, and that's something obviously wonderful about it. But anyway, where do you want to dive in with Season 2, Sean?
So one thing, let's like kind of start with the beginning of Season 2 and also talk a little bit kind of like the structure here, because this was something I remember, as watching it week to week, I was really struck by is the way that it sort of lulls you into a false sense of security, and then it just like pulls the rug out from under you. Because we talked about on our Season 1 episode that Season 1 is broadly structured on 3-episode character or 3-episode arcs, right? Where you have like an episode that sets up a duel, the episode that has the duel, and then like a transitionary episode that sort of moves the status quo and adjusts it a little bit to where you can then have your next like setup duel, you have the duel transitionary episode that kind of adjusts the status quo. With the whole structure of the show fundamentally being around, you've got your 3 boys, Gwell, Ellen, and Shattuck, and then Sletta has to duel all of them. And then the big change happens at the end of that show where the duels are functionally done, and then the Gundam happens, right? And things get like real. Noria and Sophie show up. That ends with Sletta splatting the dude into tomato paste, and that's the end of that show. Is like feeling like, okay, line has been crossed from which you can never come back, right? That's like the ending of Season 1 is what happens there after we had that really nice structure. What I love with Season 2 is it opens with what seems like is going to be the same kind of arc you had from Season 1. Episode 1 of Season 2 is all about like setting up another big duel thing, where you have Sophie and Noria show up to the school. There's like a proposal, like they're doing their like kind of terrorist stuff. And then Sletta challenges them to a duel, right? And it feels like, okay, we're setting up some kind of duel arc. We're back at the school. Some of the school stuff happens. There's a huge like montage in the middle of that episode of Sophie and Sletta going around the school, like at the school festival or whatever. That feels like it's the only episode in Season 2 that feels like a Season 1 episode, basically, even if there is a lot of things around the edges, like it being fucking Sophie and Noria in the first place, which is wild, and like Miodine's like very noted absence from everything that's happening at the Academy, because the whole thing with the splatting is sort of just like hanging over in the background, but its bones are a very Season 1 episode. And then Episode 2 of Season 2 just destroys everything. And that's like where you see, okay, this season 2 is a fundamentally different beast, because this is where, you know, the war has come to this school. Like, you cannot put the spilled milk back in the bottle. You cannot go back to the status quo. You can't just have your fun duel times at the school and your like sort of like school comedy stuff. That can't happen anymore, because Gundam has happened and Gundam is here to take it all. And the amount of shit that goes down in episode 2 is wild, because you have like Noria and Sophie start their big fight. They have like some of the kids there at the school get killed. That is the episode that fully reveals what has happened with Eric or Eddie, the girl from the prologue, and our theories about her and Sleda and that relationship and Ariel are basically proven true from season 1. All that information gets given to you in episode 2. You have all the stuff of Shattuck's entire plan with him taking his father captive and using all of that. That all happens in episode 2. And then at the end of episode 2, Sophie fucking dies. It is crazy. Oh, and all the Quiet Zero stuff. What Quiet Zero is and all of that is explained to you in episode 2. Like, episode 2 is stuffed full with so much stuff and just completely wipes out the entire status quo you're familiar with from season 1 and changes everything that's going on. It radically changes your understanding of who Sleda is as a character. It radically changes what the school is as a setting. It radically changes Shattuck and his whole place in the status quo and moves him into the effectively antagonist role he is for a lot of season 2. And all that just happens in one fucking episode. And that was one of the episodes on rewatching it that my mind was blown that all of that was one episode. Because in my memory, I was like, oh, that must happen over the course of like 3 episodes of a TV show. It's like the moon episode the moon-based episode in Mobile Suit Gundam 1, the first Gundam, where it's just like, oh, all that's one episode? How the fuck is that even possible? Because in your memory, that's like an entire story arc. And I just remember when I watched episode 2 in real time, it blew my fucking mind with how this show is like planting its flag of, this is a different thing. This is not the same thing as season 1. We are doing a very different thing with season 2 of Witch from Mercury.
I definitely thought this when I started watching it too, because I was super surprised. Because again, I had not had anything spoiled for me, but when I came in and I saw the premiere, it's not that I was like disappointed, but I was like, it's exactly what you were saying, Sean. It lulls you into that false sense of security, right? I'm like, oh, they're kind of repeating the structure. That's interesting. I didn't think they were going to do that. And like, nope, let's rip that rug right out from under you. The biggest surprise for me was doing the Eric reveal right off the bat at the end of, like, you could really edit episodes 1 and 2 together into like an UFO table style hour-long premiere, because that's effectively kind of what it is. And it is like this like intense, there will be no status quo kind of episode, to the point that episode 3 doesn't even have Suletta in it.
Yeah.
I mean, she's not even in the credits. It's crazy. So like, yeah, they really go for it. And I think that's super interesting. It's kind of funny to me that apparently there was at some point a plan to air these all as one unsplit core, which is crazy to me, because it's so clearly 2 seasons. And we know that plan, because if you look at what aired in between the 2 seasons, it's this hilarious, they recut Gundam Narrative, Gundam Hathaway, and Thunderbolt Gundam into episodes. I don't know if you watched any of those, Sean.
No.
I did. I downloaded one of the Hathaway ones because I was super curious. It's so slapdash. It's like, it was like, we need to get this out right now. It's an emergency, because it's basically just Hathaway, and then at the end they play the full version of Mobius with all the credits. It's just, that's all it is. It's hilarious. But anyway, yeah. So apparently these were going to air together, but it is so clearly 2 seasons. Like, I remember when we recorded the season 1 episode, Sean, we weren't even sure whether we should call it season 1 and 2. But when you watch the full thing, it's like, this is a 2-season thing. And I think that clear, status quo style shift they do is a very obvious sign of that.
Yeah, I suspect that probably some of like, I imagine that they probably changed a little bit of stuff, like when they realized, obviously, because all of this, none of this was made, obviously, with like season 1 was happening. So all of this would have been made understanding that there has been that split. Right. And so I imagine that certain things got adjusted and changed and stuff once they sort of understood that shape. And that probably is one of the things that makes the split so dramatically clear. Because it is like season 1 and season 2 of Witch from Mercury just kind of feel like different beasts in my head, in a way that's very sad. In the way that like is like Iron Blooded Orphan season 1, season 2 is like Mobile Suit Gundam 00 season 1 and season 2. Like those also, the second season has like a fundamentally different shape and tone. That's the same kind of thing that Witch from Mercury does, is just with each season being half the length of those.
Yeah, and then episode 3 is one of my favorites from this season because
Yes.
it's so different. It's where we bring Guel back. Because we haven't seen him yet in season 2, and episode 3 opens with us seeing that he is a prisoner of Dawn of Fold since the just horrible things that happened to him at the end of season 1, where he accidentally killed his dad. And this episode is one thing I noticed. This season has a lot of Hathaway influence in it. I think you can just tell. This episode is the clearest one, where just like the way it starts with you going down to Earth and everything. There's even some cues on the soundtrack where you can tell, I think they've been inspired by how Hathaway's music sounds and everything. But this definitely feels like the Witch from Mercury version of the big scene in Hathaway where they're running through the destroyed city as everything's going on, because this is it's Dawn of Fold trying to evacuate, Guel kind of getting back to his senses, he's trying to save this kid, and there's all this death and destruction, your kind of classic Gundam episode in that vein. But it's intensely focused. This is our one episode in the series with no Suletta at all in it. And it is mostly just about, I think, making this clear shift where I think at the end of season 1, both you and I, Sean, were like, Guel is a fascinating character, but we have no idea what they're going to do with him next season. Like, they clearly have a plan, but it was, I think, very unclear where they were going to go with him. He could be another Char clone, he could be something else. But instead, he's just straightforwardly one of the heroes of the season in the end. And I think that's a really cool choice, and you need that third episode to do that rehabilitation where, like, it really reveals that he's an extremely vulnerable character who has been, he was coddled his whole life, right? He was the son of this rich guy. He went to this school. He's never had an actual mobile suit fight. He's done a lot of duels, and those are play. That's like playing with fucking Gunpla at a certain point. Now he's seen actual death. He's done actual killing. There's that intensely powerful moment where he's trying to save the kid. He opens up the cockpit of the crashed mobile suit and sees the remains of the pilot inside and just vomits. And he comes back to that moment several times in the future when he has trouble piloting. And I just love all of that, because in the end, he's one of my favorite characters in this show, and I think you can tell so clearly going back to season 1 that everything they had him do there was, I think, all just very clearly set up for the character they wanted to have in this season.
Yeah. Guel is just one of the. I mean, all the characters in the show are the best, but he's of the best characters. He's also one of the best. And yeah, his story arc is so satisfying. To see him go from that low point of having the most Gundam shit in the world happening to him, which is him killing his father, which is what obviously is also like the echo of what happens with Lauda at the end of this season. But then him using that as a point from which to like grow and sort of learn his like sort of mistakes, and expand his perspective. Because Father and Child, episode 3 of this one of season 2, is one of my favorites as well, because it gives you all that with Guel, but it also gives you your perspective on the Earth stuff. This is the most time we spend on Earth. Like, that's one thing that's like very sort of notable about Witch from Mercury, is I think one of the side effects of it being a 2-course show instead of a 4-course show is that like Earth is not a major location that you spend like a giant chunk of the series on. It's a place you visit multiple times. And Father and Child is, outside of a couple of times where it will like cut to show a little bit of Miorine stuff to kind of move some of the plot of the show on that side forward, fundamentally it is an episode set on Earth, and it's where you get a sense of what is going on with Dawn of the Fold. You see like all the kind of war orphans that they have taken in. There's that very heartbreaking moment where you see all the kids building a grave for Sophie with all of the stuffed animals that she had left behind, because she took a bunch of them with her when she went to Astakasia, but she left the other ones here, and so they built that grave for her. And you just get that sense of the world is a much, much bigger place than what we have seen. I think, the audience kind of implicitly understands that, but seeing Guel have to kind of confront the nature of what companies like his company have been doing is really vital, because then that is the stuff that then allows the rest of the show to happen. It allows this sort of like shift of focus to saying, oh, maybe like the Benneret group does suck. Maybe what we are doing up here in space is awful. Maybe what we should be doing is helping the people of Earth. And this is like a really vital moment where the show gets to pivot its focus in that way.
Yeah. I guess one question I would ask is, do you think it is a weakness at all that we don't spend more time on Earth given that thematic importance, or does it fit the show and fit the characters that we're at a little bit of a remove from it?
I think it's like with like the length of what the show is. I think it fits what the show has. Like that would be if this was the 50 episode much bigger Witch from Mercury. Obviously, I think that would be the biggest difference. Is you would probably have a whole story arc with Soletta on Earth and all that. Just because that's what Gundam shows fundamentally do is they have a big Earth arc. It was like, and that is the one area where if they do a sequel series or they do a movie or if they do a continuation of Witch from Mercury, that would be like by far I think the most like fertile ground in this universe to do is to do a much more Earth focused story. But because like all of the main cast are people who are from space, it's fundamentally like Spacians and then Earthians who have gone to space to go study at the space school, it makes sense that that is our frame of reference and that is like where our perspective is.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think, like, I can imagine the arc where you would do a very, like, Suletta on Earth-centric story, but the problem with that is Suletta's relationship to Earth doesn't so much matter in this story. Mm-hmm. It's Miorine's relationship to Earth that matters, and we get all of that with her, I think, in the episode. It matters for her and it matters for Guel, and we get both of them in major episodes, and those are definitely episodes that I think have an impact. They really land when they come, and I think it's enough to get us there. As you say, if we do, the Witch from Mercury Zeta, whatever it would be called, that would be like an obvious area to go. And actually, I think probably the most interesting thing would be to just follow an Earthian character right off the bat if we go again and have a new protagonist. But I think for this show, it works fine for me.
Yeah, this is also where you get a character, you get Alcott, who, this was like one of the things that surprised me about the show is I thought at the time that he was going to be a bigger character. He's like the badass mobile suit pilot fighting for Donna Fold. You get like this glimpse of an interesting backstory with him that like the show never really kind of goes deeper on, although it doesn't really bother me just because it's just not what the show's about. But I like the sense of that he is. So his whole backstory was that he was a pilot for Cathedra, the like space security group or whatever. And then during some kind of attack on Earth, his family was killed and he went missing. And then now you see that he's there and he's fighting for the Earth people. And this is another area where I thought that the show was going to I thought he was going to be like a major character or something from that point forward when I first watched this episode weekly. But going back and watching the whole thing through, it's more clear to me that he is there as like an example for Guel of like a person from space who can fight for Earth, right? That it's not about where you are from, it's about like who is the group of people who are being oppressed, who's the group of people that need help, like, because fundamentally all those Earth terrorist attacks which seemingly took Alcott's family's life, that didn't happen because of the Earth people, that happened because of the oppression of the space people. And I think that there's something that's very satisfying about seeing that dude just be like, I'm a space guy, fuck it. Like, fuck all that shit. Like, I'm going to be here to fight for these people because these are the people who are worth fighting for. But he is definitely a character that, again, if there's like a Zeta Witch from Mercury, that is a character that I'd be interested in seeing more from is Alcott.
Yeah, I think his stuff is very evocative, and I agree. I didn't think like I needed more of him, but I liked his scenes a lot, and I think in that third episode, all the little flashes, you get one like detailed one where you find out where he got his scar, and you see all of that, right? And it is a really lovely scene of your kind of classical Gundam destruction, but done very soulfully. One dynamic to talk about in these, really for most of the season, is that Soletta and Miorine do not have a lot of scenes together, right? And they are intentionally separated for a lot of it. They don't really come back together until the fourth episode, but the fourth episode and the fifth episode are also when we get the second, for Soletta, what is this, her third duel with Guel?
Yes, third.
She's done it a lot, where Miorine rigs it so that Suletta will lose because she's trying to get Suletta away from her and her mother, who is doing dangerous shit. And after that, you have, an even harder separation between them. I think it's interesting, and I think it's actually something I respect about this season a lot, is that there's a lot of ways you can deal with the fallout of the end of season one, the big splat, as you've been calling it. There's a lot of ways you could deal with that. And I think the traditional way would be you would come back in the premiere and have some kind of big standoff between Miorine and Suletta. Verbally, they wouldn't fight, but you know what I mean. Like, you would have some kind of big confrontation, and you don't get it in episode 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, and you just don't get it, really, right? And I think that, at first I was like, oh, is it kind of weird that they're avoiding this? And then you start to realize the avoidance is how they're dealing with it. Like, there is a really clear gap between them, and it's in both of them. It's that Miorine has complicated thoughts on this because she comes to realize this is not really Suletta is a violent person. It's that she has been kind of pointed in a direction by this weird Shar Aznable-ass mother of hers. And this is something that, because I care about Suletta, I have to do something about. And for Suletta, you learn, no, she is not unaware that that is bad. Like, she has thought about this, and she has reactions to it. And I think the places where they do come together and start dealing with it in other ways is interesting. And I think overall, for as big a status quo changing moment as that big splat is, I really think this show does a good job dealing with the fallout of it in unexpected, but I think very honest and authentic ways.
Yeah, I just think it's the fundamental strength of the show above all things is its character writing, and it's how sophisticated, I think, like psychologically driven the characters are and how they're written. One of the things I watched after I watched each episode each week, I also would watch a writer in Japan, Mafia Kajita, who I like, who he does a YouTube channel with the voice actor Nakamura Yuichi called Washiagana. He did like breakdowns of all the episodes each week after just kind of like talking through his thoughts on them, and I found them very interesting. And a point he kept on coming back to of like kind of the thing that he identified that he thought was really remarkable about the show was how much the characters felt like they were, how living and breathing the characters were, right? That they didn't feel like they're people who are being moved on a chessboard by writers in order to make like narrative points or to try to like deliver specific plots. Like, everything that characters do feel like they extend naturally through their like internal psychology, right? Which is another very Tomino-esque thing to me, because it's just the internal psychologies of all the characters are so rich. That's something that you can feel expressed in the show. And that's one of the places where I think you can most see it is Miorine and Suletta and their, as you say, their avoidance of dealing with the subject, but also their maturity, that they're not idiots. That's the thing I love about the show. It's like no character is an idiot. They all kind of like get it, even if they're making mistakes or they're making bad choices. They do basically understand that that's what they're doing, but they just can't bring themselves to do something else. And so Miorine's confliction over like, yes, so what Suletta did saved my life, and it saved the life of my father. And yet there is something fundamentally about the way that she did it that Miorine cannot bring herself to get past. And there's something off and wrong about that. And Suletta also understands fundamentally that killing people is bad. It's not a thing where she's been so brainwashed where she has no idea of what good and evil is or morality or anything like that. But her faith in her mother is so extreme that she sort of offloads all of those concerns onto, well, mom said it was okay. And if mom said it was okay and that it would work out and everything that mom says comes true. And that's basically true in Suletta's world. Like Prospera says in one of the earlier episodes, she tells Suletta on the phone that like eventually Miorine will understand that what you did was something that you had to do. And Suletta's like very relieved when Prospera says that. And then when they have the conversation between Suletta and Miorine in the farmhouse or like the greenhouse or whatever, that is what Miorine says. And then Suletta's like, oh, this is exactly like, I'm so relieved. This is exactly as my mom said it would happen. And that's the thing that sticks in Miorine's craw is like, it all comes back to Prospera. It all comes back to these things that mom tells to Suletta that pushes Suletta in these certain ways where Suletta, despite what Suletta wants and despite what she feels, she will still go by what Prospera tells her to do. And that's like the root kind of evil that Miorine identifies, where it's like, if Prospera says kill, Suletta is going to kill, even if Suletta thinks it's wrong. And that's basically what she says in that moment. Even if she personally thinks that this is wrong, if it's what mom says, like, it's got to ultimately be right. And that's just that conversation and that confrontation between those two characters I just think is so well written, in the way that they're sort of cagey around each other, the way they're sort of like interrogating each other. Like Soleda's sort of honesty in that scene and how much every question that Miorine asks, Soleda answers like honestly and very directly. And I love that. Like it's just, there's such a maturity to the conversation that happens there that is extremely satisfying to watch when those characters are able to interact with each other.
Well, so much of the show flows from the fundamental attitude of Suletta as a character. This is another thing that I think the show's writing is just very good at. This is often a good technique, is to have the tone and I think themes of your piece extend from the person you are following. And she is a character who is incapable of falseness, right? She is just like very straightforwardly, she is who she is. And to the degree that I don't think we even see the full extent of that early on. Like, one of the coolest things I think season 2 does is all that stuff about Eric and her being a clone and all that, that's not a surprise to her. She knew that. She knew that the whole time. She just didn't say it because it didn't matter to her. It doesn't change anything for her. And when you think about it, it makes sense. But, like, I think, you know, you get the big exposition near the end of the series where she comes clean to everybody else in Earth House and explains this. And it's like, oh, this isn't... I very much thought this would be, you know, your sort of twist that would break her mind in season 2, and it's not a twist to her. She already knew it, and she's, like, straightforwardly uncomplicated in that way. And I think that's really interesting. And it's where all of the show's, I think, kind of goodness and straightforwardness in how it ends comes from as well. But yeah, I think I would agree with everything you just said about that confrontation, and also the whole ending of the show in how she approaches her mom, and that in a lot of other Gundam shows, there would be the tragedy of her having to, like, kill Prospera or something, right? And not only is that something she doesn't want to do, it's like absolutely anathema. She really does believe there is some goodness in this mother who seems horrible to us, and that she can get through to her, and there is something worth saving here. And it turns out she's right about that. That's another thing I really like about the ending from Witch from Mercury, is how Prospera lives and is redeemed through her daughter's faith in her. That not only is Suletta not false in that way, but she also is emotionally intelligent. She sees things in people that people might not think are there in themselves.
Yeah, and a lot of, like, that stuff also stems from some of what happens in episode 4 and 5, where at the end of the show, when Suletta sort of, like, spiritually confronts her mother, and like, one of the main thing that I think Suletta, like, identifies of, like, why Prospera isn't, like, irredeemably evil, because nobody in this world is irredeemably evil. That's, like, fundamentally, I think, Witch from Mercury's perspective, is that everybody is complicated, everybody makes mistakes, everyone has sins that they bear, but everyone also has the ability to move forward from those sins and do good things in the world, whether you're Prospera or you're Suletta or whoever, or Mirdane or whoever, or Ellen. And the thing that she identifies in Prospera is, she says, you know, after everything that happened with the Vandus incident and Eric and all of that, you didn't choose revenge. You choose to try to move forward and build a world for your daughter. And that choice I agree with, and it's like, and I support. And that's what she says there. And that, like, rewatching the show, you know, that, like, scene was really stuck in my head. So when you get to episode 4 of season 2, which is The Cycle of Sin, or Zaika Noa, which is just a great title, the end of that episode is the scene where Prospera tells Miorine, another scene that, like, I was just, like, shocked when I first watched it that this happened so early. Prospera tells Miorine about the Vandus incident and says, you and your family are the target of, like, my family's revenge. Like, you are the people who killed, like, your father slaughtered every single person I knew. They killed everybody in that institute, including my husband, including basically Soletta's dad. You know, she doesn't get into the complex nature of Soletta's dad, but hey, you know, that guy's DNA is in Soletta, and all that. And she says all of that there. And at the time, the first time you see that scene, I think you're still operating under the assumption that Prospera is motivated by revenge. You think that, oh, she is saying this in order to, like, get revenge, like, get that satisfaction of kind of tormenting Miordine, and you think her end goal is a revenge-based one in some way. But that's not true at all. That's not why she's saying that to Miordine. The reason why she tells all that to Miordine there is to manipulate her into cutting Soletta off. Right? Like, Prospera needs Miordine to be isolated so that she can be controlled. And the best way to do that is to drive a wedge between her and Soletta. And the best way to do that is to make Miordine feel guilt, and feel guilt for what her father did to Prospera and Sletta and all of that. And so there's like a very kind of like intentional tactical thing going on there that doesn't really reflect Prospera's fundamental motivations, because everything she does in the show from top to bottom is completely motivated for, I want to build a world in which my girl, my baby girl, does not have to be trapped inside this machine, and build a world where like she can be free of that. And that's everything that Prospera is trying to do. And that's so satisfying to see, just like, this sort of bait and switch where you think it's going to be about revenge. The show plays it off that way. But in the end, if Prospera wanted revenge, she could have gotten revenge so fucking easily. Like, we see how capable she is. Like, if she just wanted, like, the Bennett family to be dead, they would have been fucking dead forever ago. But that's not what she's trying to do. And she is willing to swallow that revenge and all that shit to work with them in order to build the world that she wants for her daughter. And all of that, I just think, is like, it's one of the many things that makes Prospera just one of the best characters in any Gundam show. But all of that is like set up here in episode 4, and then it gets paid off in that conversation with Sled at the end of the season.
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is also probably one of my favorite touches in the entire show, is that line that Suletta has. I think it's one of the most brilliant pieces of writing, is that, that you could have gotten revenge, but you didn't. That whole idea, I think, is like, it's revelatory, because I think it's genuinely something that is there throughout the whole show, but that the viewer probably has not actually, like, understood until the moment that Suletta says it. And it is so in character that Suletta is the only person in this world who would have seen that in her mother, right?
Yeah.
She's seeing the same things as all of us are, as all the other characters, as the audience, but she's the only one who really picks up on that. And part of that is that a lot of the viewers are going to be Gundam obsessives like us, who see the mask and are expecting to see Char Aznable, but there is something else going on here. She has a whole lot of Char-esque traits, but at the end of the day, she is not the person who's going to take the, momentary dopamine hit of killing Garma and laughing over his death over the radio, because she has something bigger in mind and bigger that she wants to do. And that thing blinds her to a lot of other things, and it makes her do a lot of bad things. But it is a, noble goal on some level. It is her trying to be a mother to her daughter, and that is the most understandable thing in the world, even if it does lead to all these other bad things.
Yeah, and I think it's, fundamentally why Prospera, at the end of the show, gets to live out the remainder of her life with her daughters, is because it's like, she was not, in the meta sense, she also has, broke the Gundam curse. Like, she was not motivated, she was not just the Char clone, she was not just there to be obsessed with revenge, she was playing that role for everybody else, but in reality, that is, that was never what motivated her. And it is just, she's such a complex character, and that's probably, the most complex thing about it, is you just are operating on the assumption for so long that she's just motivated by revenge, because you had the prologue, because you have the Char connections, even though along the way, everything she actually does tells you the opposite, right? You learn relatively early on that she's working with Delling. That's halfway through season 1, you learn that she's working with him to build Quiet Zero. And I think at the time you're like, oh, well, she's manipulating him so it must be revenge somewhere down the line. And it's no, that never happens. It's just not what she's about.
Yeah, I mean, and that's also a Char misdirect, because Char is working with the Zabi family, of course. He's doing it to kill them, and we think that's going to come, but it doesn't. I mean, our big hint on that is at the end of season 1, with all of the Plant Quetta stuff, is when we start to see, because she even has a conversation where she reveals her identity to Delling in a very Char-esque way, but then doesn't really twist the knife. And I think I remember flagging that moment and going, what's going on here? And I think in our season 1 conversation, one thing I talked about is that I thought the show was heading in a direction where we were going to learn Delling is not as bad as we thought. And that is true. But it's Prospera is not as bad as we thought. It's kind of everyone is, even when they do horrible things, is more complicated than that. Delling is a guy who, in that prologue, did something unbelievably horrible, but in the run of the main 24 episodes of Witch from Mercury, he's not really that bad a guy. He actually is trying to do politically things that are bigger than just for his own self-interest, and I think that's also something that's interesting.
Yeah, he's he is trapped in that system as much as anybody else, right? He desperately is trying to figure out a way to break the sort of the kind of Cold War-esque like system of proxy wars that like destabilizes the Earth and all of that, like all the war partitioning, I think is what the dub calls it, or war sharing is what it's called basically in Japanese. But like, he kind of helped put that system into place, but he's also trying desperately to find a way to break it because he understands that it's wrong, but he can't figure out another solution to prevent like a larger scale conflict from occurring. So yeah, it's just
well,
like
and
the nature of all these people. It's much more complicated than that.
It's a very literal version of the one generation to the next generation thing, because Delling's original sin in that prologue is, and I think we do learn, it is a genuine desire to break the Gundam curse. He is not, yes. It is not I think when you watch the prologue, you wonder, this must be some kind of front, right? Like he must want to steal the technology or something. He must be lying. He's not lying. Other people are. We learn that people like the Pale Technology Group, but his family is not like stealing the Gundam tech and being two-faced about it. He did a very evil thing in how he decided to stop the Gundam curse, but given what we know about the Gundams in this universe, it is the correct thing to want to get rid of those things,
yes.
Right? He goes about it in the wrong way. His daughter finds a better way to do it. Prospera is interacting with the Gundams in one way. Her daughter finds a better way to interact with them. Like, this is the cycle that the show is showing. That is a very fundamentally Gundam kind of idea, and I think the show paints a very, strong picture of it. This is one difference from something like Gundam Seed, is Seed has less interplay between generations, because it's about a lot of, like, orphan characters and all this sort of stuff. This is a show where, like, we're kind of in constant conversation with the generation right above our main characters to see how they are going to be able to do a better job in that, moving forward sort of way. I love the whole, thing in the writing also that our tagline in season 1 is always, retreat, gain 1, move forward, gain 2. And by the end of season 2, it's just move forward. It's not move forward and gain 2. It's not move forward and maybe gain anything. It's move forward and try to do the right thing.
Yeah, it's not about gaining stuff. It's not about like the tactics or the game of what's going on here. It's about you have to move forward because that's the only way to go. Either you stand still or you move forward. And it's like you gotta trudge forward even if it is hard. I think is very much the message of the show. So we're kind of like focusing here a lot on like some of the stuff that happened in episode 4, but then you get episode 5, Precious Things, and this is a really brutal episode to watch because this is the one that ends with Suletta losing the duel. I mean, she doesn't really lose the duel. Obviously, it's cheating. It's like if you turn off the engine of the car when it's like not past the finish line yet, does that person really lose the race? It's like that's not fair. This is just you have that absolutely brutal choice, and I think a choice that talking about this that with Miodine makes that I think the show thinks is like fundamentally the wrong thing for her to do. I think it is, which is she chooses to cut Suletta off completely. She makes her deal with Guel, and then at the end of that episode, Suletta has lost the duel, and then Miodine gives her Mr. Cold back, which I don't think anybody would have expected Hot and Mr. Cold, the key holders from season 1, to be so fucking feel so important by the time you get to season 2. But she gives her Mr. Cold back and tells her, like, I had you lose on purpose. Like, I wanted you to lose. Go somewhere else, like go live your life like my sweet Mercury country bumpkin, basically, and goes and leaves, and Suletta is left crying in the cockpit. And that whole episode is just brutal, but it has some of like the best stuff in it. I mean, it's got all the stuff with Guel where he goes and like visits Suletta at the greenhouse. You've got all the stuff with also like Ellen Gogo is there. It's just Precious Things is one of the best episodes of the season.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, this show works out its sort of like dark Gundam part in the middle of this season here. Because you have this episode, and then a couple episodes later, you have sort of the big like destructive climax of the season, which is when everything goes crazy and the entire school is destroyed when Norea goes on her rampage, and you have the big fight between Guel and Shadik and all of that kind of stuff. And that's sort of your like more typical like Gundam kind of high point of action, but then the show continues past that to a closing that has a lot of those Gundam elements but has a much more positive ending to it.
Yeah. But yeah, there's just a lot of stuff with the Precious Things I want to break down. One is you have all that stuff with Guel where he has come back from his episode 3, and you get this really beautiful scene that mirrors some of like the scenes from season 1 where he has these interactions with Sletta, and he is able to like confront her and tell her like I do like you. Sletta, who does not understand what tsundere is because she's not an anime fan, so she didn't realize that when he said he didn't like her earlier, that was just him telling her that he liked her. And just like that whole interaction I love, because he does that, and he says like, that's one of the parts I really like about you. And she goes, huh? What? But you said you hated me. And it's like, well, I said that because I was embarrassed. And she's just like, I don't understand. And I love, he just says like, well, figure it out. And like him getting flustered. It's like the last kind of boyish, young kind of quality you get to Guel, because past this point he like really has to grow up, but like you just get this like one little glimmer of this like of that school life thing you had in season 1, which obviously is not really in season 2 very much. You have this one little scene between the two of them that Miorine kind of eavesdrops on when she kind of realizes she needs to or wants to cut Sletta off in order to try to protect her, and to make this deal with Guel. But I just love everything with their interaction there.
Yeah, no, it's very good and heartbreaking, and yeah, this is the dark, like I said, stretch of the season that we are in. Although I really do like what they do with the Suletta stuff after this, where she isn't in a depression yet, and it's what happens after that, when Prospera takes the aerial back and all of that is what really throws her into her depressive state.
Yeah, because I think I guess one thing I want to talk about here is this choice that Miorine makes. Because when you eventually get their reunion later on, like they kind of pretty clearly mark it as like saying like what Miorine did here was wrong. Like it was a mistake to do it this way. And I think it's interesting because most shows, I think, would frame this as being like it's brutal, but it's the thing that needed to be done. In order for Suletta to move forward. But I think when you really look at the sequence of events here, that's not true at all. What Miorine is doing here is she's emotionally hurting Suletta, right? This is brutal. It's not that Suletta's affected by it at all. But it's like, but really the person most affected by this is Miorine. She's the person who's now totally cornered herself because Suletta has a whole support structure she has built up for herself with all the kids at the Earth Dormitory who are there to support her, and they're there to help her out, and they're there throughout all of these episodes there. And that Suletta's like honest and kind way of living her life has built up this group of friends who are there for her through thick and thin. And Miorine, in cutting off Suletta, has also cut off all of that because her relationship to all the Earth people is fundamentally connected through her relationship with Suletta. She hasn't built up that, like, those bonds and that support structure on her own. And this is the thing that Prospero wants, is to isolate Miorine. Because the thing that Suletta actually has to do, and the brutal thing she actually has to confront in order to move forward, is her mom, and it's Ellie, right? And so it's like, it's the scene at the end of episode 6, Our Empty Selves. That's the one where she goes up to the colony or whatever to go talk to Miorine with everybody else. That's when, like, she goes through the hangar and sees Ariel there, because Ariel has kind of like set up that she wants to have this one last talk with Suletta before everything else has to go down. And it's through that conversation, her conversation with Ellie there, and then Prosper coming out and telling her, it's like, you have to go live your life. You're not a part of this family anymore. It's effectively what Prospera tells her, because they're trying to cut her off too. And that's the thing that Suletta needs. Suletta needs that, effectively that umbilical cord to be cut and for her to be fully separated, because that episode ends with her in the fetal position, floating through space, crying with the Earth in the background. It's one of the best last shots of any of the episodes, that is filled with so much obviously symbolic meaning. And that was like the brutal thing that Suletta needed to confront, not the Miorine stuff. She could have confronted all the stuff with her mom and Ellie and all of that, and still had her relationship with Miorine. In fact, it probably would have been better for everybody involved if Miorine had tried to organize that kind of confrontation, to push things that way. But Suletta would have had this moment. Eventually, no matter what, Suletta was going to eventually have this confrontation. Eventually, Prosper's plan is to use Suletta to get the Ariel to be able to get past level 8 or whatever of the permit stuff, so that way Ellie can take control of it and do all the Quiet Zero stuff. And once that's done, their plan was always to cut Suletta off. It was always to have her be able to go live her own life somewhere else and not have her be burdened by all the sin and all the everything else that Prosper and Ellie have taken on. So it's like Suletta is going to have this moment. And so Miorine doing this incredibly brutal, cruel thing to Suletta and cutting her off that way, I really like that the show, I think, really unequivocally frames it as this was a mistake. This was the wrong thing to do. And a lot of the second half of the season would have probably gone a lot smoother if Miorine had not done that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to frame it. And it's, a corollary to all of that is something we need to talk about, which is just how well fleshed out the cast over at the Ostacasia School is, and everybody at Earth House, which is what creates that dynamic that you're saying, Sean, that Suletta, without Miorine, still has that sort of familial connection that she's built over at the school. Like, she has definitely done the bucket list thing of making all these friends. She's popular. Everybody loves Suletta. Just like in the real world, everybody loves Suletta and has drawn all their fan art of her. Everyone at the school, some people think she's a little weird, and she is a little weird, but everybody likes her fundamentally, right? Even the characters who try not to like her wind up liking her. Like the girl who is like totally head over heels for Guel. There's that whole episode before she gets almost killed, where like you can tell she is like trying to like be annoyed at Suletta and just can't keep it up because Suletta's so nice. But she has this familial structure in all these characters, and even though none of them have a super like ton of screen time, Choo Choo never gets a big episode of her own in this stretch of scenes. Martin is never the star of a subplot. They all have, like, I think, really good material in the background and feel like pretty well-rounded real characters by the end, which is what allows for a lot of these dynamics where Suletta has these multiple sort of familial structures that she's built around her.
Yeah, and it is like, it's one of those great strengths of Witch from Mercury is that even if a character only has a little bit of screen time, their designs are so strong, the vocal performance is so strong, and like, even if they're not the focal point of scenes, their like personality and their opinions and what they say all like stand out and are really notable. So yeah, like all of the kids at the Earth Dorm, I feel like you get to know them all really well, even if like, they're always all in like the same scenes together, other like Choo Choo obviously is a little bit more notable, Martin's a little bit more notable, Nika's a little bit more notable, right? Those three are like the ones that kind of stand above everyone else. Say probably like Lila K is probably the other one that's probably like one of the more notable ones, but in general, the rest of the Earth Dorm characters are all, they're the Earth Dorm characters as far as like the audience is concerned, but they do really have interesting personalities. They all look very different from each other, and they just stand out so well. And it's true of every side of the show. Like, I know one thing I saw after the show finished was somebody tweeted out that Cecilia, who's the girl who runs the duel committee, who she's got a lot of great stuff this season, right? She has that whole, like, in episode 2, like, what sells the danger in, like, the horror of the mobile suits actually attacking the school is her being there and reacting and being like, what's going on? Like, what do you mean, like, someone actually just died? Like, these are real guns? Like, her reactions there, because she's always so sassy and in control of stuff, really sells that moment. That character only had 7 minutes of screen time across both seasons of this show.
Oh, that's wild. It. Yeah. She leaves a big impact in this season in particular, is great, yeah.
Yeah, and that's like, that just, I think, shows how good the show is in its fundamental writing. As a character like that can stand out so much and have so much, like, sort of, people who are, like, just fans of that character because she's so cool. And she gets, like, one of the best scenes in the epilogue, too, because she just gets some really juicy material. But she's only in the show for, like, 7-something minutes. And it's like, that's crazy, but that just shows how good this show is at building up those characters and how efficient it is at using every, like, minute it has available to do... every scene is doing a dozen different things. It's establishing characters, it's moving plots, it's exploring themes, it's doing all that kind of stuff all at the same time. And so it is how this show is able to get away with only having 24 episodes, but still be able to have so much meat on those bones.
Absolutely. And I think, you were talking earlier, Sean, about just how strong the character psychology is, how smart... Not that every character is a genius, but just that, like, they feel like real people. They act like real people. You can understand, like, there's a way that everyone is kind of thinking through things where they don't just feel like everything has been reverse engineered from a plot decision. And I think you see that with a lot of the Earth House characters in this stretch we're talking about after Suletta really does fall into that depression. I love everything that comes after that when everybody is worried about her. But then you start to see everyone else's issues come into play. Like Martin has his whole hang up about he's the one who reported Nika and got her, arrested by Grassley House and all of that stuff. And he feels bad about it, and he feels unsure about revealing Nika's secret. And when he finally comes clean about that, after Suletta is kind of dragged out from the kitchen when she tries to go get food at night, there's all these, like, follow-on character dynamics that come out of these scenes. Like Martin revealing this, you come to realize nobody blames Martin for it because, like, they understand where he was coming from fundamentally. But then there's these complicated emotions that come out because of Nika, because Choo Choo, like, really looks up to that character, but now has this, really conflicted feeling about it. But then when Nika comes back, they're blah, blah, blah. Like, there's just, like, so many cool follow-on effects where you can trace everybody's character psychology, even in pretty brief scenes. And I think those group dynamics are really interesting.
Yeah, because, there are certain, like, nobody really blames Martin because how could you? Like, what an impossible scenario to be in. But everyone has different opinions on whether or not what he did was the right thing. And that comes from the episode with probably, like, for me, my favorite and the most sort of, like, essential episode title. This is episode 7, Ichiban Janai Yarikata, or Not the Best Way. But that's where Suletta learns, because someone uses that expression, that it's like, it wasn't the best way to deal with this, but it was the only way I could, or it's the only way I could think of. And that's where Suletta sort of has that epiphany about her mother and realizes that at that point, like, even with everything that's happened, she still loves her mom and still wants to try to solve this. And also, obviously, connects to Miorine. I mean, it connects to every character, right? Because a big theme in season 2 is sin, and it's about mistakes and, like, what do you do with those feelings of guilt that come from making these mistakes? And part of it is, like, that fundamental empathy of understanding that nobody ever does something the best way, right? The Ichiban Yarikata, like, the best way to do something, that's a thing that you can only ever say after it's happened, right? And for people in the moment, like, you're motivated by so many things and affected by so many things that, like, you're never going to find the best way to solve something. And just because you made a mistake or you couldn't figure out the best way to deal with a scenario doesn't mean that you're, like, beyond saving or you're beyond hope. There's still... you still need to move forward from that point. You need to learn from that mistake and try to figure out a better way to handle something like that the next time it happens. But it's such a powerful scene of all those characters to say, like, talking about and discussing their feelings and their relationship to what Martin has said, and then Suletta doing the same thing and her connecting that to all these other experiences she had in the first half of season 2, because this is the midway point, and her connecting it to her mom, her connecting it to the things that Miorine does. I think it's one of the places where she, like, implicitly kind of, like, forgives Miorine, like, in herself for what Miorine had done. And sort of, like, deals with those themes. And it's just such a beautiful moment of all those characters around that little table that they've moved off to the side at dawn so that they can have food in this, like, kind of bright spot. And them all eating, like, their sort of, like, homegrown, goat milk and all that kind of stuff. And them having that chat. It's just so wholesome and so powerful. And it just expresses the real maturity of all the characters involved, that they can have that kind of conversation with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. What else do we want to talk about from this sort of, like, middle stretch of the series before maybe getting into more of the climaxy stuff?
We're just saying, just a shout out again to Martin. It's like, poor dude. It's like, you feel so bad for him in this middle stretch of the show where everything that's happened with Nika, it's just like, what an impossible situation that character was put in, of having to try to figure out how do you sort of both sort of respect your friend and your trust in your friend with the reality that they have done something really awful. Like she is connected to these terrorists that have killed children at the school now. It's like, how do you possibly resolve your belief that Nika is fundamentally a good person? Because she is. And your, like, need for her to feel safe and supported with your responsibility to take care of everybody else in the Earth Dormitory and your responsibility to the school as a whole. Like, what an impossible scenario. And you have that great scene where he goes to, like, what is basically like a Haro confessional or something. Like, I guess it's like the school counseling thing or whatever. And that's where you learn that, I guess, Cecilia sort of, like, moonlights as a, like, part-time counselor or something like that at the school, because she's on the other side as he's talking to the Hado, and she just sort of looks through the window at him, and says, like, man, you really are a backstabbing bastard, aren't you? And then, blackmails him into, like, giving her a pedicure and shit. It's so good. But you gotta feel bad for Martin. And shout outs to Inoki Junya, who's the voice actor who plays Martin, who he had a very funny statement at that live stream I talked about earlier that aired at the end of the last episode, where a lot of it was him talking about, like, I really didn't expect this character to end up being so important, to have all this material. And I, like, totally agree with it, that I pegged Martin was going to get fucking got for sure. Like, he just seems like a dude who's going to get killed in a Gundam show.
Well, I think we predicted that. I think at the end of season 1, we were like, Martin's totally dead. Yeah.
He's so nice. He's so nice, but also he's not so essential to the show that if he gets killed, it's not like, the show can't go on without Martin, unfortunately. I like you, Martin, but you're not, like, the central character. And it's just so cool that character just gets some really juicy material and gets, like, a lot of really good stuff, particularly in this middle section of season 2.
Yeah, I love Junya Inoki. He's the star of Jujutsu Kaisen, but I sometimes forget that because he often plays more bit parts like this, right? And he's always so good at it. He's very good at these characters who kind of blend into the background, but don't, in part because I think he gives a sort of soulfulness to them. And there's obviously the animation and the writing is doing that as well. But Martin is definitely a standout in a way where I did not think... I would have thought either we wouldn't talk a lot about Martin in season 2, or we would be talking about Martin's horrible, tragic death. And we're talking about neither of those. We're talking about much nicer things that happen with Martin.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description, and remember to check out the Weekly Stuff podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games and everything else on all platforms.
And now, back to the show.
Another thing I want to mention here is, I think one big signal to me that this show was going in a different direction than I anticipated was that Shadik is basically taken off the board at this midway point of the season. Yes. When you have the big attack. One, I just love the way Guel and Miorine figure it out, that they're talking, well, Miorine isn't in that scene, but it's Guel and one of the Space Assembly guys who are talking to this kid, this, like, war orphan, and is talking about the prince, and they realize that this is Shadik. And then Guel just goes off, and he's so angry and flies out there, and they have this big fight and everything, and it kind of loses, kind of wins, but eventually Shadik is overtaken because he overplays his hand as well. And then Shadik is in jail for the rest of the series, and he does ultimately do something good. He does something fairly redemptive in that he not only fesses up to his crimes, but he takes on all the Quiet Zero stuff as well. And I thought that was interesting, because I think Shadik was one who we were like, oh yeah, with a bullet, he's definitely dead. Like, there's no doubt, I think when we talked at the end of season 1, he's clearly going to be one of the ones who gets got. But no, he not only lives, but has a fairly redemptive arc at the end where you do understand that he did very bad things, but like a lot of the characters, out of a desire to do a greater good, that when we see all of the stuff on Earth and we see some more of his backstory, you do completely understand where that comes from, even if you don't condone the actions, and that's very good and very, very Gundam-esque writing to do.
Yeah, all that stuff here is so good because, a lot of what you're talking about, this is all like stuff in episode 8, The End of Hope, which is like probably the most jam-packed episode of any episode of this show, because The End of Hope, this is another one where I couldn't believe it when I rewatched the show, that the Shadik and Guel fight and Noria's death are in the same episode, and that blew my fucking mind when I rewatched it, because I would have swore that those were in 2 different episodes. But everything in this section is the stretch with that stuff is so good. Where I agree with you, the way that Guel learns about Shadik is so effective, because he's with Kananji. He sees that little kid when he and Miorine go to Earth, because they've been manipulated by Prospera to go there, because she wants to investigate all the Ox Earth stuff. And where all the other Gundams came from. But he sees that little kid there that was with Donna Fold, goes and follows him, have that chat. And I like that, like, the only thing it took to figure out who Shattuck is just to talk to one of them. Is just go to Earth and talk to like one of like a little like a poor little orphan kid there, and that's it. Because everybody there knows who Shattuck is. It's just that none of these people ever talk to anybody on Earth. They never talk to any of the people affected in these kinds of war zones. And so Gwell, having that level of empathy he learned for the Earth people in the father and son episode, is the thing that like gives him that ability to then learn this information and go confront Shattuck about it. And yeah, then let's just like talk about Shattuck at this point, because his stuff I think is so effective. I mean, he's such a cool, interesting character, because I think while he does get to redeem himself to a certain point at the end, it's like he's a fascinating character where he kind of never really grows. He's the one of the three boys, with Gwell and Ellen, because Ellen also changes so much at this, like, because his change really kind of starts at this point. But of those three, Shattuck is actually kind of the same person all the way through. It's just that, like, it took a long time to figure out who he was. Because fundamentally, at the end of the show, what happens is what Shattuck wanted to happen. It's just it didn't happen the way that he planned, right? His whole plan fundamentally is to find a way for him to become the president of the Benneret Group, use the Space Assembly League, the government organization that clearly like is not happy with the Benneret Group having the amount of authority it has gotten over the decades, and using that to dissolve the Benneret Group and distribute its funds to different Earth corporations, thus fundamentally breaking this kind of proxy war setup where the space is able to control Earth by strategically allocating resources to different groups and creating an eternal conflict zone that prevents Earth from sort of like being prosperous enough that it could potentially become a power that could threaten the security of like this kind of nation of space people. And so he wants to do that and give and sort of put Earth on an even playing field with everybody else. That is exactly the thing that Miraidine does at the end. All she needs is the Grassley House approval to do that, and that's the thing he signs at the end of the show. But it's like, I think the thing that's brutal about it is it kind of shows that Shattuck, if he figured out a better way to do it, to connect that not the best way idea, he could have done all this without having to do the terrorist attacks on the school and shit like that. Because what he does is so brutal and unforgivable in The End of Hope, where he has so accepted the logic of the people who are oppressing him, because that episode, The End of Hope, has all this stuff in it where you get these lines about these really effective lines of dialogue from Noria about her perspective on like why she is so angry and everything. And she has this line she says to Gogo where she says, "You Spacians will never be able to understand the anger we feel at Earth people's lives being cheaper than space people's. That's like our lives are valued less than yours, and you will never be able to understand that kind of anger." I think the brutal thing about Shattuck is his actions fundamentally like work on that same logic. He sees people's lives, especially the Earth people who work for him, as disposable and as like tools to be used and to be spent towards a larger goal. And he treats his own life that exact same way, right? His whole plan was always to do the thing to sort of balance that situation and then use himself as a scapegoat. His goal was always to end up being in jail. His ending point of the show is fundamentally what he was planning to happen for himself. It's just the way it got to that point was not what he expected. And so him accepting that logic and sort of seeing the world from that like meritocratic point of view and accepting the oppressive logic of the space people in order to try to accomplish his goals using subterfuge and using deceit is the thing that leads him to this very tragic point. And it all goes back to season 1, where his whole story arc in season 1 was about how he was too cagey and kind of cowardly and too in his own head about his plans and his schemes and all of that stuff to be able to do the simple thing of stepping over that line and embracing Miraidine and saying, "I choose you, I'm going to fight for you, I'm going to be in your corner." Even though that's the thing he desperately wants to do, right? He loves her. He wants to be with Miraidine. This is the thing that he fundamentally wants, but it doesn't fit into his schemes. It doesn't fit into his worldview of like dog eat dog cutthroat world that he grew up in. And so he can't ever bring himself to do it. And that relationship gets snipped when it's still unripe with like the tomato imagery they used in that. And like from that point on, Shattuck is never really able to change, and he never really changes his perspective or his methodology on and how he views the world. And it's the thing that I think just makes him this really tragic character, and it's fundamentally the reason why he loses. Because when he fights Guel, right, he underestimates Guel. He underestimates the amount of change that Guel has undergone, because he thinks that Guel is just an idiot who's charging straight at him, where really Guel is feinting that and has sent his funnels around the other side so that they go and they disable Shattuck's machine. And he tells Shattuck that, like, this really beautiful line about, if all you do is take, you will never truly have anything, because he never builds anything of his own. And that's the thing that ultimately spells Shattuck's failure, is that all he sees is the world where you take things and spin things. He doesn't see a world where you can build things, or a world where love exists, and so he can't possibly win.
Yeah. I think that's like one of the most straightforwardly tragic arcs we get in the show because of that, right? Shattuck is a classically tragic character, in that it is all these fundamental things about him that hold him back from ever fulfilling his goal, even though, and I do love this dynamic, the noble part of his goal is fulfilled by other people who learn the lessons in a more reasonable way.
Yeah, and who didn't, like, grow up, like, part of it is also just, like, his scenario means he could never sort of see outside that box. Like, there's one thing I love about this series is the three different groups, the Jatarks, the Grassley House, and then Pale. They all like represent three different flawed methodologies for like inheriting power and as like government structures, right? The Jatark House is all inheritance, so it's all like we just like inherit it by bloodline, and that obviously creates a lot of issues with like the friction between Guel and his father, where it means that Guel just has to be a tool for his father. It is the thing that creates everything with Lauda, because Lauda is like a bastard child, right? He's Lauda Neal is technically what his last name is, but he was brought into that family. You have that whole scene later where you kind of see that flashback. But like,
and what makes Guel different from his dad, crucially, is how he embraces his brother, right?
Yes.
He is different than the other Jaturks because he doesn't just view it on that inheritance level. He is like uncomfortable in this family.
Exactly. And then you've got the Grassley House is a meritocracy, because the whole thing that the Grassley guy is doing, and this is part of, you get more exposition on this in that scene where they're talking to the kid, because the kid wants to go to this academy that Grassley runs that picks up all these war orphans and just like basically tries to figure out who's the best one of all these like war orphans we've taken, and we have them all be candidates to inherit the house, and have it just be this sort of very brutal, cutthroat kind of like, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and prove you're the best, and that's how you inherit things. And that's where Shattuck comes from, and all the Shattuck girls, they all come from that world. And so it's like Shattuck never is able to see beyond that framework that he's given, that very meritocratic framework, and I think that is what destroys him. And then my favorite is the Pale Technologies one, which they don't spend as much time on, but you do learn in this season that Ellen Karras, the real one, was selected by like an AI, and that the AI is the thing that like sort of runs the company secretly behind the scenes to a certain extent. And I love that, like, they don't spend a lot of time on the AI idea, but it's that as soon as you hear that, I think you're like, well, obviously that's never going to fucking work. Like, because of course this guy's going to betray you. Because you know what that AI is not like selecting for? It's not going to select people for like their loyalty and their empathy and their compassion. It's the one thing we know about Ellen Karras is that he's probably pretty smart and he's a complete asshole. And so at the end of the season, when he just betrays them and says like, yeah, fuck off. Like, I got headhunted. I got hired by someone else. Bye. He just leaves, and they're all just sitting there fucking slack-jawed in disbelief as what just happened. But it was like the most obvious bomb that was going to blow up in your face, because of course the AI picked a complete fucking jackass to run your company, you fucking idiots. It's great. I love it.
I loved when we learned that too, because it snapped into focus. So if you had any like lingering questions about what's the deal with Pale House, it just makes sense now. It's like all of that makes sense. The Ellen because Ellen, like the actual one, not Yongo or Gogo, like the actual original human being, always seemed like boy, he's kind of an asshole. He doesn't actually seem as good as they say he is. Why is he the one over? It's like, oh, okay, it all makes sense now. It's this fucking AI thing that they have this weird faith in, and of course at the end he just kind of fucks off. And even he has his last scene is with Guel during the kind of epilogue, and it's very funny because you can tell like Guel trusts this guy as far as he can throw him, but you know they're gonna see what they can get done. It's so good.
Yeah, it's like all that shit is, I mean, just like all of that, the houses are set up and how they kind of explore those different concepts is very effective, and you know Shattuck gets obviously kind of crushed within that system, which is very sad. Another then character that we should talk about at this point, because we're at this like episode 8 End of Hope, is this is where Noria gets killed, and this is like a really, I think, a powerful scene, because this is also where you really get all that stuff with Go-Go, because you have a sequence of scenes over the couple of episodes leading up to this where you have like the most awkward room in the entire world, which is Noria, fucking Nika, who's had the shit kicked out of her by Noria, and then Go-Go eventually joins them, and they're just all trapped in this weird room in the Grassley dorms or whatever, and you just have these scenes of them all together, and Noria's just like furiously scribbling in her diary and just mumbling to herself, die, 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 and Nika's like cowered in a corner with like bandages all over her and shit, just like, what is happening here? And Go-Go's just laid back on the fucking couch, just it's like, whatever, man. Like, hey, if nobody's trying to kill me right now, I'm fucking happy as a duck. Like, it's like, this like place me somewhere my life isn't in danger, and I'm a happy camper. And through those scenes, you just get that slow sort of development of how, you know, Go-Go sees a lot of some of himself in Noria, but there's also, I think, a strong implication that he sees a lot of Yongo, and they knew each other, right? Whatever, you don't get a lot of like, you know, you don't get a big flashback or anything, but it's clear that whatever sort of like training and stuff like that they went through, they would have gone through it together, and he knew that guy. And Noria's a lot like her, right? She's, you know, like any big Gundam pilot, she's like trapped by the specter of death. That being a Gundam pilot hangs over you, because to be a Gundam pilot is to constantly be like towing that line between life or death in order to pilot those machines. And that development of that relationship leads to Go-Go's sort of full reveal that he is not the like weird creeper pervert man you thought he kind of was from season 1, where he was more of a gag character there. But he's like this very like full, complete person with like a very complete worldview that hinges on like how important it is to live, and that living is like the only way that you can move forward, right? Fitting with like all those other themes. And when Noria is freaking the fuck out, you get the most Hanai Natsuki moment ever, where he just goes up to her and she's not hearing anything he's saying, and he just shouts at her, come with me, or in Japanese, it's such a simple sentence. She says, Boku tokoi, like, come with me. Like, if you can't figure out a way to live, if you can't figure out what to do, come with me. I will be with you, right? And this is also, again, this is intercut with all the Shattuck stuff. I think it's like meant to kind of compare, this is the thing that Shattuck never could have done with Miorine, even though it's what he wanted to do, is to put himself out there and say, come with me, I will be there for you, I will help you find whatever it is to live, but the only way we can figure out how to live is by living. Like, you have to, if you die here, you will never learn how to move past this point. You will never learn what could have been or what could be in your life. You have to just live so we can move forward and push forward, and I will be there with you through it. And of course, that is also then the moment where she dies after asking him what his real name is, and she smiles and gets shot. But it's such a powerful scene that really sort of like puts Go-Go into that sort of like main character with like a capital M, capital C letters for this show, where you kind of thought he was a sort of more of like a weird jokey background character that was sort of like the lesser version of LN4, and then LN5 is like one of my favorite characters in the whole show. Like, he's fucking amazing at this point.
Easily, probably my favorite thing, or at least the thing that I think took me aback most in season 2, is the transformation of Go-Go, of LN5, and like, because LN4 makes such a big impact in season 1. It is like the emotional heart of the first half of that show, is a lot of the stuff around that. It's so beautiful. And then you have this version who is just a complete joke character early on. And even in the first couple episodes of season 2, that continues. Mm-hmm. And then by the end, he is one of the like beating heart and soul parts of this series. And I think what Witch from Mercury does with the 3 versions of Elon and Hanai Natsuki does with the 3 performances he gives. It's remarkable. I think it's one of the biggest creative coups in this entire series, and I think that entire journey he has, and that we see, like, one of the key thematic, like, observations of this entire series hinges on that character who, because of the very like, on the line life he lives, he has been created to die. He has been created to be put in a Gundam and die, and he is more self-conscious of that than anyone else. Elon 4 was pretty self-conscious of it too, but in a very defeatist way where he just didn't allow himself to hope. But this guy has been like, I'm going to enjoy life as much as I can until that point, and I'm going to try not to get to that point. And he's going to talk to other people who are in that point of view and try to get them kind of on his side about it. And I think, obviously, as you're saying, it contrasts with Shoddyk. It contrasts with a lot of the other characters. It's very crucial to, I think, the end of the series, where a lot of other characters come to have a pretty similar philosophy. And then he has one of my favorite moments in the epilogue, which is that sadly, he cannot travel the world with Norea, but he can bring her along in spirit, and he can go to those places that were in her diary. And of course, he has a very funny and very Go-Go-esque line at the end where he's like, man, you should have written where these were, which is very funny, where he's like, because he's having trouble finding all of them. But it's beautiful. And, on one level, it's honestly kind of surprising Hanai Natsuki has the time to be doing other non-Demon Slayer shit sometimes, especially a role as big as this. But it's also so cool to see him stretch his legs in a completely different role than, like, his big, leading man role over there. It's so cool to see him do what he's doing here, because it's an incredible... It kind of is like checking all the Hanai Natsuki boxes from all of his other roles in one set of characters he has in this show.
Yeah, because there is was one of the sort of stock roles. He doesn't get it as much anymore, obviously not, because he's plays a lot of protagonists and stuff. But for a while, he definitely played a lot of, like, weird pervy dudes in anime, because he has that good, like, he can play, like, oh, he seems pretty normal. It's like, oh, no, he's not. Like, that's his character in Sword Art Online Season 2, like, to a T. And there's, like, a couple of other characters I'm going to think of that have that kind of model. And that's what I think, like, kind of think Go-Go is going to be, to the point that it's, like, kind of ridiculous. Like, he has his whole scene, I think it's in Season 1, or Episode 1 of Season 2, where he just, like, really goes in really hard with it on Soletta and just completely strikes out, and then Sophie, like, comes and pulls her away. But he's just, like, the biggest creepazoid in the fucking world. And I love the reveal where it all makes sense, where it's like, of course this guy has no idea how to seduce anybody. How would he know how to do that? Like, he's like this weird, probably orphan guy who's been raised his whole life in this, like, weird camp by the fucking AI ladies to be a body double for this asshole. Like, at what point would he have learned the social skills to be able to, like, seduce Soletta Mercury, someone who also is completely unseducible. The least seducible person on the planet and the person worst at seducing have to run into each other. It's like the most hilarious, like, rock and a hard place scenario possible. It's great. But yeah, like, I just love that slow reveal of when you kind of really get to learn, oh, this is who this guy is underneath all of it. And yeah, Hanai Natsuki plays it with aplomb. And it's probably my favorite episode of the radio show they do for Witch from Mercury was the one where Hanai Natsuki guest stars. It's him and Yuki Aoi, who's the voice actress for Noria, are on an episode together. I think it's after the End of Hope one, so because they talk about some of those scenes. And just, like, hearing him talk about how he's like, yeah, I mean, obviously I had no idea. Like, when he played Go-Go in Season 1, he had absolutely no idea where that character was going to go. And so it's, like, very funny to hear. It's like, I had no idea this is going to end up being, like, such an important character to the show. And it's like...
It sounds like that was a theme for a lot of actors in this series.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very... Yeah, his whole performance and everything with Ellen is, like, just one of the most delightful things about this show. Because I think nobody expected Go-Go to be important. Like, this, like, it's just the most surprising thing about Season 2 is the direction they take that character in.
But I think everyone, unless you were the actors playing Suletta, Miorine, or maybe Prospera, I think every actor must have gone on something of a journey with their characters, because they are all so different by the end. And often have such big shifts or changes or go in unexpected directions or are bigger or, like, more focused in ways that you didn't expect. It's true of a lot of the cast.
Yeah, I mean, there was one of the episodes for season one, I remember the voice actresses for Felshi and Petra, who are the two Jatark girls, right? Felshi is the one that goes and saves Gwell in Lauda's life. Petra is the one who's Lauda's girlfriend, who also gets crushed under the rebel
Right.
Around this point in the show. Because, yeah, that's also in the End of Hope episode is where Petra gets crushed. Like, they had an episode in season one on that podcast, the radio show, where they're like, yeah, we don't, I guess, I mean, we're doing stuff in season two, but I don't know, because I think it was between season one and season two is when they were on. They're like, I mean, I know we're coming back, but who knows how much these characters are going to be in it. And both of them clearly, like, the way they talked about it, they both like clearly expected that they thought that their characters are going to die in season two, just because it's like, I mean, they have a clear perspective on the hierarchy of characters and where those two characters sit, and it's not at the top. So it's like they're expendable characters, and it's something that is very fun about watching the show after hearing a lot of those interviews with the cast and stuff, or like discussions between the cast, is being like, man, everyone gets all these juicy moments. It makes you happy for the actors that get to play those characters, that they all get like really good big moments, and the show doesn't forget anybody. Like, everybody gets to come back and have big stuff in season two also. It just must be very satisfying to be someone like that like you just have no idea, oh, that Martin's gonna have this big character arc, or Felsi goes to go save like one of the big fan favorite characters in the show, and Felsi gets to go save his life. Like, that's like, these characters just get cool moments, and that's very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final stretch of episodes here, I think we've already broken down most of what's going on here. I do just want to say, you compared it earlier to the end of Zeta Gundam, obviously not in the everybody dies way, but there is like a certain intensity to it, and I think one way it made me think of that is just the sheer number of political actors moving behind the scenes on this. There definitely came a point around episode 9 or 10 here, when we're sort of laying out the shape of the final episodes of the series, where I did definitely have to pause an episode and go, okay, who's the Space Assembly League? I don't know. I don't remember. Because I think if I had started watching this nearer to when we watched season 1, I wouldn't have had that problem. But I definitely had a little bit of like, there's a lot of proper nouns. We get to the part about Ox, Earth, and I'm like, which one were they? And I'm not saying this in a complaint kind of way. I think it is, and I think in part it is an intentional overwhelm, because it is about, in a way Tomino does a lot too, like the complex interlocking political actors of the world are supposed to be a little impenetrable, which is also why it is very satisfying at the end when Miorine is just like, all right, fuck it, we're all done. We're all dissolved. All of it. Fuck all of you. And it's great.
Yeah, because, there are definitely a lot of moving pieces. I think being, like, rewatching it, I think I have a general sense of how all of them fit together, but I think you're right, that you're meant to be very, like, confused and kind of, like, thrown in the midst of it, because it's, like, because that's shit is, like, so weird and confusing in real life as well, when you have, like, these multiple different political factions that are all kind of trying to maneuver around each other, and it's, like, the Ox Earth, because Ox Earth was the company that bought the Vandidus Institute in the prologue. This is all stuff you learned in the prologue, and they're the people who turned the Gundam technology into mobile suit weapon technology. And then at a certain point, Ox Earth was seemingly dissolved after all the thing that happened with the Vandidus Institute. But in reality, the Space Assembly League took all the Ox Earth stuff, created basically more or less like a shadow corporation that they are using to help arm the Dawn of the Fold, because the Space Assembly League wants to get rid of the Bennett group. They do not like that this super mega corporation has effectively taken control of the major political power in space. And so all the stuff I think like does make sense if you dig into it and you rewatch the show and are looking for it, but it is definitely very complicated at first, but it does like rewatching it when you know things like, the space laser thing at the end, and there's the guy who's working with the Pale Corporation. That dude is actually set up like several episodes ahead of time in the background. It's just you don't know at the time that he's going to be important, so you're not looking for it. But when you've seen the show once, you're going back through, there are a lot of like little pieces like that you pick up. One of my favorite like very Zeta Gundam-esque touches in this stretch of the show is where you have the episode in not the best way. That is also the episode where the attack on Earth happens, that Prospera does. And then in the episode after that, I think at End of Hope, near the beginning of that episode, you learn in the background, like on a radio broadcast, that Miorine has won the president election because of that, right? That there was all this talk about how, if she goes and forcibly suppresses these protesters, like the space people are going to fucking love that shit, right? And so that will get you a bunch of political points. And I love that kind of just in the background that happened. And that's the most Zeta Gundam touch of all time, is that like this huge status quo shifting thing happened, but you're not going to have a whole episode that's just dedicated about making that like technical expository point. It's like, that's not important to tell a whole story about. It's just a thing that you need to know as an audience member in order to see like how the shifting like political factions are moving at this point in the story. And I eat that shit up. I love that shit. Like the more important background details there can be, the more happy I am.
Well, and it's a scene that's communicating multiple things at once, because it's not just what you're talking about. It's also, that scene is when we see just how broken Miorine is. This is when she is in her deep depression, and it is both communicating the basic expository point that she won the election, but also that the winning of the election means nothing to her. In fact, it is a burden, and it is this, like, this is seemingly a victory she's been trying to move towards, but it is something that now that she has it, she can't even really act on it because she is so broken, which of course leads to the absolutely stunning, beautiful scene where Suletta comes and they have their big reunion finally, which is sort of their longest scene they've had in the season so far, where Suletta is the one ultimately who is able to build Miorine back up and help Miorine get her groove back, which she totally has for the last three, as evidenced by her like costuming and hair and everything, where she is in total confident Miorine mode. But the scene that builds up, through that is really one of the best in the show.
Yeah, so so now we're at episode 10, The Woven Path, which is like the whole first half of that episode is building up to that scene, because you have Miorine, who has locked herself into her room. She's doing, like, this is like the most Gundam protagonist thing ever, even though she's not the actual Gundam pilot. This is like one of those other things where I think it kind of is playing a little bit with that iconography. She's doing the Amuro thing from First Gundam, where she has like the blanket over her head and all that kind of stuff. And Suletta comes to get her out of her funk. You have the great little duel she has with Goel to get the holder title back, which I fucking love, that little fencing fight. I love that Suletta, like, every time the show has an opportunity to show Suletta, like, as, like, a physical actor in the world, that she's just a fucking monster, right? Then you have that whole big chase at the end of season 1 with her and Miorine, where Miorine, like, can barely keep up and is just, like, gasping for air at the end, and Suletta's totally fine. You have, after the big attack happens with Norea at the school, you have the scene where Suletta is like trying to go help like people who are trapped in the rubble, and she's just like casually lifting up these massive slabs of stone and chucking them aside. It's just like, I love Suletta's physical presence in this show, that she's really tall. She's like not that much shorter than Goel. Like, I'm pretty sure she's taller than like Ellen is. And she's got the really broad shoulders, and she's just really physically capable, which of course you'd have to be, because she's the best pilot in the show. You have to be in really good shape to pilot something like that. So it makes sense that she would absolutely just be able to beat Goel in that little dumb fencing match and win the fight. But she gets the holder title back. She goes for Miorine, and she talks to her through that door. They have that conversation we've kind of talked about mistakes and how they've both made mistakes, and that Miorine, or Suletta, has learned that you need to move forward. This is, I think, the first time she says this, to the effect of, like, it's not about gaining things. You need to move forward. It's not about move forward game 2. It's just you have to move forward no matter what. And then she asks if she can open up the door. And I love this detail where Miorine says, no, I want to do it. And you have this great shot where she stands up, and you have the shot just basically of her legs that follows her as she walks all the way across the room, all the way to the door. And it's just this one unbroken shot.
It's a CG shot they have to do, because they literally do a whole camera turn where she is obviously a drawn element, but they have to turn the room into CG for a moment to do this big camera swivel they do. It's really smart.
Yeah, and it's just a really interesting, very creative way to frame this and to feel every step she has to take, because she's the one who has to open up that door to cross over the line there. She opens the door, and you have this great reverse shot where you see her, and it's like the most fucked up any anime character has ever looked. Like, she really looks like someone who has just locked themselves into a room and just been crying for days, because her hair is totally messed up, her face is messed up, and she's got like baggy eyes and all this. And then she and Sletta like hold hands, and then like their hands like embrace, and there's just this long animation on like their hands intertwining into each other. And then it cuts to the sort of basically the commercial break. And then it comes back from that. You see both of them running down the hallway, and Miorine is dressed in her suit and has her like hair is all done up. And there's something about that where I feel like they shot it and cut it in such a way to make the audience very keenly aware of the fact that Miorine would have had to have taken a shower. There's something about like she had to be so put together. And to me, it's like I don't think they actually had sex, but it's symbolically very sexual, right? Like the intertwining and the interfolding of their hands together, the intimacy of that with the cut to like Miorine had to like, do her whole thing to be put back together, which like feels like, oh, she had to have a shower, and like Sletta had to be there and all that kind of stuff. That it's like, it's a very kind of almost like post-coital moment where she has sort of like, they have reunited like spiritually in that way as well. And I really like that element of how all that soul sheen is shot and framed and put together.
No, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. The characters never kiss on screen. And I think it's interesting. I have not seen any complaints about that. And I think it's because the hand-holding motif, which is there from the beginning of the series, it's in the theme song for season 1. It's here in this moment. And then it is the last shot of the series, is their hands meeting again. It feels so intimate. It feels like almost uncomfortably intimate, like something that we are like peeking in on in someone's real life. And it's, the animation in those moments is just extremely detailed. There's so much characterization in how it's, the hands touching versus actually embracing, what the characters are feeling in those moments. And I feel like there's a level of intimacy to that's why I feel like I haven't seen any think pieces on like, why weren't the characters allowed to kiss? It's like, because look at that hand holding. It's like, it tells you everything you need to know. There is an intimacy to that just is really startling.
Yeah, because really, like, even heterosexual couples in Gundam very rarely kiss. Like, that's one of the things that's, like, unique about Gundam Seed, is how frank Gundam Seed is about that. And, Gundam Seed has a fucking sex scene in it, which is wild for a TV Gundam. I mean, even, like, non-TV Gundam almost never does it. But there's no kissing, but there is, I agree with you, there's, like, a real physical intimacy between Sletta and Miorine that builds up. And especially like in that moment, and it like, it feels so personal and warm, and a lot of it is like the way that it's shot and the way that it's animated, where it just like feels so real. And also, there's a lot of those kind of like visual callbacks with the hand stuff, because the last time we saw Sletta outstretch her hand to Miorine was the end of season 1, where the hand was covered in human blood. Tomato juice, and obviously Miorine doesn't take the hand in that moment. And so it's like one of the things that kind of brings you back kind of in that full circle sort of way of where they can now, they've both gone through this big journey of having to independently face their demons and their sins and all that kind of stuff. And now they can come back together and physically embrace in that way again.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that scene really accomplishes for me is underlining this dynamic, and I think you were talking about this a little bit earlier about Miorine's mistake in cutting Sletta off, is that Sletta could be okay without Miorine. Sletta has other support systems in her life. She has other people she can lean on. Miorine needs Sletta. She really, really needs her. That's kind of, if there's a codependency to the relationship, that's the direction it runs in. And I don't think it's unhealthy. I think it's actually a very healthy, like, Miorine is someone who has never allowed herself to really trust other people and to open herself up to other people. This is the one person who's gotten in there. And when Miorine does not have Sletta to be there for her, she winds up being actually a fairly weak person. She's like very unable to like accomplish the things she wants to accomplish. She's someone who has a lot of, I think, trouble moving through the world without the strength of this person who believes in and loves her unconditionally. And it is why she is able to get her groove back in a way she really doesn't have at any point in season 2 up to that point, is when she has Suletta in her corner again, and they have effectively, you know, rekindled that relationship. And she is extremely strong when she has someone, when she has like the spouse figure she can go home to and fight for, you know? And I think that is one of the coolest things about it, because Suletta is someone who gives of herself to most everybody she meets, and Miorine is someone who is not used to that or often able to do it. And that's the way this relationship is in some ways so special, is what it does for her, even more than what it does for Suletta.
Yeah, exactly. The way that sort of plays against your sort of expectations on the outside, which is that Suletta externally seems like such a sort of fragile, shy, closed-off person, whereas on the outside, Miorine is so brash and brazen and so commanding. But obviously, like, internally, they are both the opposite. That's one of the things of, like, why I like the way that they physically express Suletta in the world, is because I think that reflects her, like, her fundamental inner strength as well. That, like, she is, when she wants to do something, she can do it. Like, she can enact her will on the world in this very, like, strong, powerful way. And Miorine is the opposite, right? Like, she appears big and very powerful, but like but she's physically very short. She's one of the shortest characters in the whole show. Like, she doesn't have that sort of ability to affect the world through her just like physical actions in the way that Suletta can. It's another way that those two characters are sort of paired together very well.
Okay, so Sean, for these final episodes, we've, we touched on a lot of the big sort of movements of it early on, but where do you want to go just talking about how this show wraps itself up?
Let's see, yeah. So we kind of talked about the Guel and Lauda stuff and how, that sort of, that great kind of undercutting of the whole Gundam trope of family must kill each other, right? And again, it's a reflection yes. of the end of season 1. And that's like where I think it like fully, for me, like watching in real time, because that happened in episode 11. And that's where it feels like, oh, that's what the ending of the show is going to be, right? Like, I feel like very clearly, like, okay, you've set in stone. This is a different kind of ending for a Gundam show, because you have set up all of those pieces to reflect the same kind of tragedy that happened in season 1 between Guel and his dad, but this time it gets to go different because of how much the characters have grown, right? Because Felshi, even though she's not a major character, as we've said before, like every character in the show goes through growth and is and like Felshi used to be someone who bullied all the other space kids and Choo-Choo, or the Earth kids like Choo-Choo and stuff. But then over the course of the Earth dorm, like helping everybody out and like the multiple times the school got attacked, every time that happened, like Choo-Choo is out there like on the front lines taking care of shit, and she helps save Lauda's life. And so that sort of bond that grows there helps sort of Felshi, I think, be the person who gets to be there, because there's a specific scene where she says that Guel has left her behind because he had already gone to be with Miorine. She was left behind at the academy, and she's like begging the Earth people, like, please let me go with you. I want to go on this mission. I want to help you out. Felshi is one of the only other pilots we have on the show, and they let her go with them, probably because that relationship has like been fixed or something, that like they have actually built something there that's not based on like space racism, but like this sort of mutual trust and this belief that everybody's working towards a common goal. And like all of those things are the things that then blossom into her doing the most amazing thing in any Gundam show, which is just saying, stop, you idiots, you fucking morons, no, let me put the fire out. Now go sit in your room and like think about what you have done, you dumb morons. And it's just, I can't express how like hard I cheered when she came out. Dude, it's like, you can't die, Guel. Like, you're too cool. You're too good of a dude. Like, what a good dude you've become. I can't have you just go out like a punk like this. And then Felshi saves the day, and it's the best.
It's the best. I love how everyone is drawn in that scene. I love the way, even amidst, he's in the cockpit and he has his helmet on, but you can still see how, like, chastened Guel is in that moment of just like, oh yeah, I was kind of being histrionic with all this, wasn't I? I was being a little dramatic. Yes. It's great. But yeah, And then obviously you have everything going on with Suletta and her mother, and we touched on a lot of this as well. What do you make of? I mean, we already talked about the symbolism of it, of deconstructing literally the Quiet Zero and the Gundams from the, on, they even say it's on a particulate level as it is coming apart. And it is in this, it is like basically our big new type moment of the series where she goes past the level 8 and is doing all of this with Eric, and all of it comes together in this beautiful rainbow haze, which I feel like is not an accident.
Yes, and you even have like the first Gundam solar system-esque giant space laser, because every Gundam needs to have some giant space laser somewhere. I like that she just like turns it off. It's just like she just like flips the off switch. You also have another, I think, good little kind of callback, or like sort of slight reference, but that also is indicating the way like this is using the Gundam iconography differently. Is you have that one very minor character, but she's like an admiral or something for the Space Assembly League, who she's like there with the whole fleet observing Quiet Zero, and when the space laser shit starts happening, all of Suletta's people are like trying to get out, and that admiral decides not to go engage with them, and someone's like, "Are you sure, ma'am?" She's like, "Yeah. No, do you want to get caught in the crossfire with that giant thing?" It's like calling back to like Revel and stuff from First Gundam, and them just getting obliterated by the solar system and like the giant space lasers. You have like all of that of her just sort of like destroying and dismantling, as you say, like at the atomic level, just ripping apart all those like things, the side of the like sins of the past that they have inherited, flipping the light switch on the giant space laser. It's all very effective. You also get here, I mean, you just have all of the stuff with Suletta of her having to use the Gundam without having Ellie like take on the Gundam curse, and
the
all that is,
and all of that. Yeah.
Yes. So let's start there with the fucking Caliburn. In terms of mobile suits, what a fucking badass Gundam that is. Where there's a lot of stuff built in there. I think there's like, I'm always going to see a tall geese anywhere, and that's the tall geese of Witch from Mercury, which I want to say I maybe called out that there should be something like that using Caliban, because that's basically what this is. Because, we talked about on the season 1 episode that there is a sort of light sprinkling of like references to Shakespeare's The Tempest, with like Prospero being like Prospero, and they're like the revenge stuff being like a major theme and all of that. And obviously like the witch stuff connecting to that, Ariel, which is a fairy from The Tempest. So here is where you get Caliban, though they write it as like Caliban in Japanese with an extended vowel. And so that got transliterated as Caliburn in English. And I think it's a dual reference to Caliban, who is the monster from The Tempest, who is like one of the more notable characters from that play, and then Caliburn, which is Arthur's first sword from the mythos. That's the sword he pulls from the stone, because Excalibur is a sword he actually gets later. That's the sword he gets from the Lady of the Lake. So I think it's kind of a dual reference there. But I like that the Tempest stuff here kind of collapses together to like Suletta is both Miranda, the daughter of Prospero, who is like the thing that like Prospero like loves and is what he's really fighting for. And so that's like it's dual rolled across both Suletta and Ellie, who is also like Ariel, who is a fairy that Prospero controls. But then Caliban, who is a creature created by Sycorax, a witch that used to rule the island before the story of the Tempest happens. And so all of those characters are kind of getting conflated together into Prospera, Ellie, and Suletta, and there's something about that I find very satisfying, that they do a thing that is kind of a classic thing now to do with Tempest, where you draw a very clear parallel between Prospero, the wizard that currently rules the island, and Sycorax, this mysterious witch figure who never actually appears in the play, but her history with the island is really important, her creating Caliban, who's still there. And obviously Sycorax being like one of the most famous witches in English fiction, like that, even though it's not name dropped, is there, I think, in the shadow of how they're using some of this Tempest stuff. And all of that is super cool, and I appreciate all of that and using some of the symbology from the Tempest. But more important than that is a sick Gundam called the Caliban that is the tall geese, that is like, oh, this is the super old Gundam that, like, it's way better than anything else we've ever made, but it doesn't have any filters. It's like, it doesn't, it's a fucking, like, it's really good, but it's a stick shift, so it's like, you gotta be, pretty badass to handle this one. And that's a trope I will always go for because it's great. And Suletta having to sort of like, go through the trial of actually taking on the burden of the curse herself, which I think is necessary for her to kind of like understand Ellie and like all that stuff and everything that happened, and she needs to experience that. I like that it makes it very explicitly clear that like Suletta winning all those duels was not because like Ellie was controlling the aerial or something. It is because Suletta is an amazing pilot. Obviously, like, it helps that she didn't have the Gundam shit happening to her, but she was fundamentally controlling the aerial that entire time. So, it shows how capable and effective, and, she's like the most untouchable pilot in like almost any Gundam thing. Like, in terms of like her like record in this show, the only time she ever loses is the one time where they turned her Gundam off in the middle of the fight. Any like straight up fight, like this whole thing with Ariel that has an entire army of other Gundam bits or whatever fighting with her, Suletta fucking basically is winning that fight. And there's just all that stuff I find on that Gundam fan level, just hugely satisfying getting to see Suletta kind of strut her Gundam hero stuff, and be the Gundam girl, which she isn't for a lot of season 2. There's not that much her fighting of the Gundam in season 2. Like, she's not even have the aerial for the entire second half of the show. So it's cool to like have her come back, her be a badass pilot. It's also wild to have the pilot of the Gundam have to fight their own Gundam at the end. That's another like cool sort of like thing you've never seen a Gundam show do before, is make the Gundam like the literal last thing that they have to overcome, rather than it being kind of this like symbolic white devil thing that you sometimes get in Gundam shows. This is like, you actually have to go there and like have to tackle with what the Gundam is and what it represents and what it's doing, not just as a symbolic threat, but as a literal physical threat in the world.
Well, and that's working on multiple levels, right? Because it's not just that she is fighting the Ariel, which was her Gundam, but she is fighting the Calibarn too. Like, it is this thing that is going to kill her, and it is... all the Gundams are going to kill all of their pilots, and so the ultimate final act, the entire idea of, disintegrating them from that particulate level, is that there will be no more Gundams, right? She has destroyed them. She has gotten rid of them. She is floating out there in space alone, so that we can have our very clear Gundam F91 reference that they also have to do, which I'm very glad they do, because it's one of the best things you can reference in all of Gundam, which is Miorine coming and floating with Suletta in space, which is how two people in Gundam love each other, if they embrace while they are floating in space together.
Yeah, their helmets touched in space with the sun in the background, or the Earth in the background. That is a Gundam kiss. Like we said earlier that they never kiss. That's not really true. They F91.
That is a good...
That's the most intimate kiss that you can have in a Gundam.
Indeed, absolutely. But no, it's also, I think, a fun turn on most Gundam shows since Zeta. Zeta started this, have the character get a new Gundam at the halfway point, right? And almost every Gundam show has some version of that. In Gundam 00 and Iron-Blooded Orphans, it's a little more like they get an evolved version of their original Gundam. But still, that's usually how we do it. And in this show, she doesn't have a new Gundam for most of it, but the Calibarn does effectively play that role, with the extra twist that it is so she can go fight or at least confront the Ariel, all of which I think is a cool twist on things. It's definitely the show, I think, in a good way, having its cake and eating it too, in that we get all of the cool Gundam shit, while it is also able to, I think, cogently make, the thematic point about what these weapons are, and that the only way the world and these characters can truly move forward is if they rid themselves of them. And so you have Miorine do that through the politics, which is her side of the world, and you have Suletta do it through what is almost, not even almost, what is a fully, like, spiritual thing that happens, right? I mean, it is literally her last moments with her mother in the show before the epilogue is the ghosts all visiting her. And it's even implied that Suletta is not, like, in her actual body, fully aware of what is going on, but you do see her spirit and Ares' spirit and the spirits of even Ellen number 4 and all these characters who have been kind of caught up in the realm of the Gundam and of the data storm, all confronting Prospero, which I think is just one of the most beautiful scenes in this show.
Yeah, and it's something where, like, with the show being titled The Witch from Mercury, I feel like it sort of, like, helps sell the space magic stuff that you get at the end of a Gundam really effectively, because it is, like, Suletta casts a spell, right? She is the Witch from Mercury from the title. Like, she does this thing that, like, defies all logical boundaries. The show gives you this sort of sci-fi space with the data storm and all that to play with, like, what is literally physically happening there. But it is magic. Like, it is, she casts this spell. There's this line that Sletta has in the fight with Ellie that reflects a line she had at the beginning of season 2, where at the beginning of season 2, she says about her mom, Prospera, that she's always right. She's like a gentle magician. And then at the end, in the last fight, she says, I don't want my mom to get turned into some awful magician or some evil magician, basically.
Yeah.
And I like this sort of like that writing trend of like the witches and the magic, in what form that magic can take, and then ultimately this like final spell, which is what connects everybody together. As you say, we get Ellen Yongo back, which was very nice to see him again. You get these like apparitions of like Noria and Sophie are there, and then you get all the Prolag characters back, which is like very touching, and they get to connect with Prospera. And that leads to one of my favorite shots, which is the shot where Prospera she hears Ellie's voice and she turns across the camera, and as she turns, her helmet and all that stuff disintegrates away, and she turns to face her daughter. Good. Such a beautiful shot, and so touching when that she gets to finally sort of like see Ellie again, because she's never been able to see her, right? Like, she's been able to communicate with her to a certain extent and hear her through the data connection and all that she has with her helmet and everything, but she's never been able to see her daughter since she died in that cockpit. And so it's a really powerful, touching moment, and that's where we have all the lines that we talked about earlier about, the Sletta forgiving her, saying she agreed with her choice not to pursue revenge, tried to pursue a future. All that stuff is just like the best, and it just feels like such a full conclusion for these characters. There's also some stuff like that kind of connects to some of these ideas, like ideas of motherhood, where you skipped over a little bit. There's all those scenes where Miordine and Gogo and everyone infiltrate Quiet Zero, right, and you have that gun fight between them and Prospero, where there's so much good stuff there. The animation there is amazing. All the like 0G animation of Gogo like floating and spinning around cover and him shooting the pistol and shit and fighting the Hados is amazing. But you have all that stuff of Miordine's mom, who had implanted the code in the genetically modified tomatoes, because her mom was also one of the main people who developed the Quiet Zero in the first place, for how to dismantle like the code to turn off Quiet Zero, and that it's it leaves that message behind that says "I love you too" from mom to Miorine, and that's like right after Prospera is coming around the corner, and she tells her like mothers are stronger than you think. Little girl, basically, and that's right before all of Prospera's plans get dismantled by the specter of this mother whom we've never seen, not Rhett, but who trusted her daughter to be able to move forward, right? Like, she did the thing that Prospera and that Delling and none of the other parents we've seen in this show have ever really been able to do, which is let go of their kids and have faith in their child that they're going to be able to make the right choice and be able to move forward. And so Notret gives that power and authority to Miordine from beyond the grave. And that's just a thing that, like, Prospera can't bring herself to do, is let go of either Ellie or Sletta, really. And that's why she loses. And all that stuff is also so thematically powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of smart stuff going on here. And I do, as you say, I love the detail of Miorine using the relationship with the unseen mother who trusted her to defeat Prospera, trying to do this sort of well-intentioned but wrong-headed version of motherhood.
Yes.
It's just, this is a very intelligently written show. And in fact, on that note, I just want to sing the praises of the writer of this show a little bit more, Ichiro Okochi. One thing I noticed, if you go through the notes, he wrote almost every episode of this thing. 18 of the 25 episodes, he is either the sole credited writer or wrote it with one other person. There are only 3 other writers on the staff and only a couple of episodes that his name is not on, which is wild. He's had just an incredible career as of late. I mean, I started to notice that he's kind of like writing everything when I was watching both this show and Lupin Zero, the recent Lupin ONA prequel thing at the same time, and realized he had written both of those. He wrote Lupin the Third Part 5. He is taking over for Spy Family in Season 2 and the movie, which I feel like is a lot of stuff to write all at once, but he is doing both of those, which is definitely like, as a series composition gig, going from From Mercury to Spy Family is about as big a hit-to-hit jump as you can make. And then you look at everything else he's written in his career, really impressive. And I think all of the character stuff, you can tell there is just such a clear authorial hand on this thing. Because it's the other side of the credits I want to talk about is just how many people are storyboarding and directing every episode, which is crazy. But it is always kind of interesting. Even on episodes where you have like 7 directors and 6 storyboard artists, you will usually have just the one writer. And I do think there is a pretty clear sense of, like, as with a lot of the Tomino shows, where Tomino is usually the main writer on those things, there's just a real sense of solidity to the writing of this show.
Yeah, and it is like a rare anime to me where, like, the writing of the dialogue specifically just stands out to me so much. Like, there's so many really great lines, whether they're like complex lines or very simple lines. They're just like, there's a real sharpness to the way the dialogue is written, in that, like, Go-Go saying "bok tokoi," like the way that line cuts through everything else that's happening in that scene is so strong. That line that I was mentioning of Prospero, who comes around the corner saying basically, like, mothers are stronger than you expect, but the way she says it in Japanese is "haha wa tsuyoshi yo," which just, it's very simple, but it's very strong. And obviously you have Mamika Noto giving those lines. There is a line by Prospera that is just the juiciest line ever. It's earlier in the show. It's in the Cycle of Sin episode. It's that scene where she's talking to Miudine and telling her about the revenge stuff. And she tells her, like, basically, you accuse Soletta of being a murderer, but your hands are covered in blood too, because you're trapped in here with us. You two are within the circle of murderers. And the way she says that line, which it connects to the title, which is Aika no wa, which means the cycle or circle of sin. And she says, Hitogoroshi no wa no naka ni. And it's just this, like, the way that Mamika Noto delivers it, but, like, the rhythm of that line of, like, you are in this line, like, within this cycle or this circle of killers is so strong. And it's just a thing that, like, I feel like when I watch anime, usually, like, there will be some good lines that stand out, but I usually don't, like, notice the dialogue being written so sharply. So I like that you point out Okochi, because it is just a thing where it's like, the writing specifically of this show, both in that maxi sense of, like, the themes and all that stuff is so strong, but also just in that kind of moment to moment, scene to scene, what the characters are saying and the way that they say it is so well written and so fully considered, that's the thing that makes it so strong. Like you recently, Jonathan, and some of the weekly stuff podcasts have been talking about, you finished watching the show Justified, which is a show in English, like American TV, that is really hailed for its dialogue and how memorable and sharp and, like, striking the dialogue is. And I would say, like, Witch from Mercury is like an anime version of that for me. Like, it's still written in a very anime style, but the lines and the words and the choice of words that is used for each line of dialogue always really stands out to me each episode. And so it's like, I have a bunch of quotes from the show in the back of my head when I'm watching it, because those lines just really stick out.
Absolutely. You've never seen Code Geass, right?
No, I have not. Okay. I really need to watch that one, obviously.
I feel that too. I mean, I had forgotten it's not just he wrote it, it's Goro Taniguchi directed it, who's just one of the greats. We need to find some excuse to watch that show, because that was like, that was, for those who don't know, that was Okuchi's first big, like, original thing he wrote, in terms of some, a story sort of he created and characters he created, and it's obviously very famous, and it's, I think, a precursor to Witch from Mercury in some ways, is what I've heard from people, so something I would love to dive into at some point. But yeah, just a writer who I'm following more and more, because it's definitely, he's someone in that kind of, like, Mari Okada vein where you, like, look at the list of credits and you're like, this is fucking nuts. How does one person do all this,
Yeah, how does one person do all this? But I think also you can see with some of those kinds of things, like, that there is like a voice in there,
Absolutely.
right? Like he's not
really
just like a
voice.
writer by hire, right? It's like
Well, you can tell it because he's done a lot of like franchises, and not just franchises like Gundam where you're creating the story and the characters, but franchises where you have maybe less leeway too, but you still see the voice come through. Lupin Zero is a good example of that because that one just has also just a really crackling sense of dialogue. I think is a good example.
Yeah, very good stuff.
Yep. Can I talk also, though, about the credits for the directing and storyboarding? Yes. It's nuts. It's nuts. Sean, episode 11, Unrelenting Tenderness, which is, we've, praised the Guel and Laudas scene, but a lot happens in episode 11. That has, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 credited storyboard artists and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 credited directors. I've never seen anything like that, except for some other episodes of Witch From Mercury. The finale is only 3 storyboard artists, but it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 directors. Unbelievable. That's very rare you see this in anime. Witch From Mercury at the beginning is not like that. It's kind of funny if you go back to the beginning. The first couple are just, they're storyboarded by Hiroshi Kobayashi, who was the overall series director at the beginning, and then directed by one person usually, and then it starts to get a little crazier in the middle of the season, and then by the end of that season 1 you have a bunch. But by a bunch I mean like 3 or 4. Season 2 just fully embraced the well-organized chaos of what I presume this means is you are divvying up the episode into very focused sequences for someone to take, and I can understand why, because episodes 11 and 12 have, in terms of mobile suit action, the way they communicate the speed and ferocity with which Suletta is moving in the Calibarn is out of this world. It is one of the most amazing things I've seen in Gundam. You would have to go through at 1/4 speed to fully see everything that is going on. It is moving so fucking fast. And of course, one of the amazing things they're doing, and we talked about this in season 1, is that with the exception of very few shots over the course of the series, mostly the mobile suits are drawn by hand. They are not CG assets that have been, recolored or something like that. There's a couple once in a while, but overall it is all hand drawn. And it's just unbelievable to see, because it's been a while since a mainline Gundam has done that. The Build Fighter series, I guess, but they're not usually as ambitious in terms of what's going on screen. So you can totally understand, and it's true even of episodes without a lot of mobile suit action, where you can understand why there are probably a lot of directors and storyboard artists working, because the character animation is often just as detailed and I think awe-inspiring to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something where you can really tell that this was like a titanic feat to try to get this show made, because it is partially because it's a smaller episode count. It feels way denser with mobile suit stuff, particularly in season 2. You don't go long stretches without any big mobile suit scenes. There's a lot of it in season 2, and so you can tell that it was a big thing to try to get this show put together. I mean, if you go to Anime News Network and you just try to scroll down on the credits page, it is so long. It's insanely long for a 12 episode chunk of a show. It's pretty
even
crazy.
The way they laid out the end credits, they clearly shifted how they do it in season 2 in the end theme, where they have the ACONT, which is the storyboard, and the director credit at the bottom horizontally so that they can lay out all the names, which is just very unusual because they knew they would need the space for some of these episodes to just lay all these fuckers out there. Oh, I love it. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is absolutely insane, that side of the show.
And usually when you see stuff like this, and we said this with season 1, you would assume the show would suffer. This sounds like the kind of thing where I think if you described on paper, they were doing, one storyboarder per episode at the beginning, and by the end they had 7 directors per episode. You would go, what the fuck happened, and is it a mess? And it's not. It feels very, very confident and well put together, and I think it's just the sheer, this is a massive group effort is what happened.
Yeah, but it feels like the sort of top-level vision of the show is really strong and clear, so that way, even though you have, dozens and dozens of different companies working on this. It's insane if you go to the Japanese companies list and how many people, the in-between animation, the list of companies that worked on the in-between animation alone is taller than I can fit on one page on my monitor, right? It's, insane. But that top level, the writing and the direction at the top are so strong in the show that I mean, that's what anime is. That's how the vast majority of anime is made. Whether this is extreme, it's on the extreme end, but all anime basically is made through this process of having all these different companies having to work together and divvying up the work, because it is, it's very fucking hard to do anime, particularly on a TV schedule. And this show seems to have been especially hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. The credits get very dense there at the end. Speaking of the credits, can we talk about the theme songs for this season?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God. They were good in season 1. I think this set of songs is stronger. Mm-hmm. I think particularly the ending theme. What's it called? Red Birthmark. Red Birthmark, yes. With by Ina the End, is, I think, up there with Gino Senko as the best overall ending theme Gundam has ever had when you combine the music and the animation specifically. Mm-hmm. And of course its use in the show, where that show starts with this like wail from the vocalist that comes in at the end of usually pretty heavy episode endings. It's an incredible transition, and then the animation for that ending is out of this world. The imagery of like Suletta having like this light ripped out of her by the aerial, and then you have all of the Miorines who wind up like dancing in this like almost like Wiccan-esque circle around her, and then finally it's like them as adults as a couple at the end. It's beautiful, and then the opening as well I think maybe gets a little outshined by it, but Slash by Yama is an incredible opening with some really cool imagery, particularly around Elon. Has that great shot where it goes through the two halves of his face. Just both of these as pieces of music are great, but I think particularly as they are used as theme songs, just above and beyond. So good.
Yeah, they're phenomenal. I actually agree that I think it's even better than season 1, and I love Shikufuku by Yoasobi, and I was very happy to hear it come in at the end here in your classic anime tradition of bringing the original opening theme back. But yeah, I mean, especially because the show gets so much darker in season 2 that it, Slash kind of reflects a lot of that tone change. There's a lot of really good lines in that opening that, like, depending on at what point you are in the show, it feels like it's different characters, or like the lines resonate with different characters, talking about like, these emotions on your face that don't fit you, and stuff like that. And the you that's pulling a trigger you think is righteous. A lot of things like that, like, depending where you are in the show, it feels like it kind of reflects different things about different characters, which is really great. But absolutely Red Birthmark is like an all-time great Gundam ending. I love the as each episode leads out, you get that kind of opening, just like really deep, like kind of techno bass that song opens with. And that's usually at the end of each episode. You get some of that, and just like it creates this sonic space for the song to eventually like shatter basically once the actual ending starts, and you have Ina the End like doing that kind of wail to bring in the song. And yeah, then the animation itself for the ending is shocking. Like, it's just so stylistically out there, like based on what you would expect, like the really bold, striking use of red across that whole ending animation. And then there's that part where the aerial reaches into Sletta's body and it explodes into rainbows, basically. It's fucking great stuff. Something else on the opening theme I just remembered that's pretty cool is if you're like paying attention, there's like 3 or 4, maybe even more different versions of the animation for the opening theme, where when the chorus comes in, there's a section in the animation that shows a bunch of the different mobile suits, and that changes over the course of the season as the mobile suits change. So like early in season 2, you have Noria and Sophie's Gundams that show up in that section. By the end, there's a really cool animated sequence of the Caliburn fighting Ariel that's in there. Like at a certain point, like as far as that the one that Lauda pilots, that gets thrown in there. So like there are little things that adjust. When Guel gets his really cool short haircut, that is reflected in the opening animation as well. So they changed it periodically, which they did once or twice for season 1. They do it a lot more for season 2, and that's always like a fun thing. It's always fun to like try to spot where the changes have happened when the opening theme happens, which is there are lots of tweets every single week. You would get a new tweet if you followed this stuff of someone putting a video that had all of them together to like so you could try to spot the differences, and that was very cool.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to highlight with this show is the absolutely out of this world soundtrack, which I think took another step up in season 2. It's Takashi Omama did the music. It was always good. I just think it gets better and better. The continuing reworkings of that main big Witch from Mercury theme that is used in like the duels early on, and how just insanely big it gets by the series finale with just the number of choral elements and voices in it. It's really cool. And then I think this second season has more sort of like quiet Blade Runner-y-esque stuff that very much reminds me of what they did on Hathaway, and is like a musical direction for Gundam I really like.
Yeah, there's the scene in episode 2 for season 2 where Prospera is explaining what Ellie is and Ariel is to Balmeria, and that's when you get this like very creepy piece of techno music that's intercut with this very haunting image of this ghost-like image of Ellie in her like as a little girl in the astronaut suit, but like in this sort of like vague abstract white space. A similar thing plays when Gogo tries to steal the Ariel, and Ellie's not having any of that and just fucks his shit up. Like some of those tracks are really cool and definitely remind me of some of the style you get from the Hathaway movie. But yeah, all across
Hiroyuki Sawano,
yeah, and all across the show, this like the soundtrack is phenomenal, and the way that those themes are kind of brought back up and reused. And yeah, by the time it is this like that main theme has evolved into this huge, almost like in another Sawano comparison, an almost Unicorn Gundam-esque, just massive sweeping hero theme for Sled at the end. It's so satisfying because it just feels like she's so earned this giant like superhero theme song she basically gets at the end when she's going to fight Ariel. Yeah, it's good. And you know, it's something we've talked about basically in every Weekly Suit Gundam, is how bizarre it is that the soundtracks for Gundam stuff is just like incredibly high quality average, but that definitely continues throughout Witch from Mercury as well.
Absolutely. The soundtrack is coming out at the end of July, and it is a full 4 discs, which also is like a lot for a 26-episode anime. And I have that on pre-order from CD Japan. I'm very excited to get it. I want to listen to all of that.
Yeah, I was very annoyed when they never released a soundtrack for just season 1, because I just wanted to hear like the actual versions of the songs.
Yes.
I'm glad that stuff is finally coming out.
Yeah, I think they probably just wanted to wait for it all to be finished, and it's cool. The packaging for it also looks very cool, so I'm excited for that. Anything else you want to say? This has been a long podcast. We probably need to wrap it up. But what else to say about the Mobile Suit Gundam, The Witch from Mercury?
There's a few things. I just want to like shout out some of the stuff in the epilogue, which we didn't talk about much, but I really like that little epilogue. I just like getting to visit all the characters. You get Nika has her like whole new shortcut look that's really good. We talked about like Cecilia has the best scene where she just gets to tease Gwell, but now like in this official capacity for that company that hired Ellen, which is really good. But you have that just really beautiful moment of Miorine getting to be with Sleda. You see that she's recovering. You see that Prospera's there in the wheelchair. There's like a lot of very intentional shots that highlight that they're both wearing wedding rings that are like glistening with a glint in the like sunset. And they're like cuddling together on that hill. You've got Ellie, who is alive inside of Mr. Hot, which is the best fucking thing ever. That the last spell that the Witch from Mercury casts is putting her sister inside that little dumb key holder. And all of that shit is so good. And I just like, you know, I've talked about before on Gundam that I mean, this isn't even a long TV show, so it doesn't need the epilogue as much as other shows do. But my preference for TV shows is to have that kind of ending where you get to see a better sense of what happens to all these people later. And I really, really just love that epilogue to death. And I cannot express how relieving it was to feel like, okay, all these people are okay. It's like Sled is good, Beauty is good, and they're happy and they get to live together. Because, you know, with Gundam, you just don't expect that. You just don't expect a happy ending, and this is just like unequivocally a really happy ending. And I love all these characters so much that I was very relieved that is the direction that they went in.
Yeah. Anything else from the show? I have one other thing I maybe want to look at, but
one other thing I want to shout out, because we talked a little bit about some of the voice actor stuff, and they're all really good, but I want to specifically shout out Ichinose Kana, who plays Soletta. After that live stream I've talked about a couple of times that happened after the show finished with that last episode, like you could really tell how like emotional she was about like her connection to the show and how much like she really really loved Witch from Mercury, not just as like a person playing the character, but just as a fan of the show. And it's like when she had the last sort of like message at the end of the live stream to try to leave everybody off with, and it was like she kind of couldn't even get through it because she was so emotional about it. And it just was like really touching. I just like want to shout out like how good she is in the show. Like it's an unbelievable performance as Sletta, like how much she communicates about this like really complicated character that has so much going on, and how much Sletta grows over the course of it, and how like steady of a hand her performance was. But also as someone who watched the show week to week, and listened to their like radio show that she hosted that broke down the episodes and stuff, it's like she was just such a like was and is going to continue to be like such a great sort of like spokesperson for this show and like what it kind of represents and for the fans, because you know she just seems to, she loves it so much, and she loves Sletta so much, and she's such a good promoter of that show, and every time she gets to talk about it or be on those live streams and stuff, it's like she's just always so good. And you know that kind of lead for a show like Gundam, you know, this is the first time a woman has ever had to do that for this franchise, because it's been such a male focused franchise forever. And so I can't imagine like the kind of pressure someone like that has on them, because this is by far the biggest profile role she has ever had. And it is this kind of like boundary breaking role within the franchise. But she has like pulled off that role of having to be both the star and a steward on all these sort of ancillary media around it. And she's just been so fucking good at that stuff. And I just found it incredibly touching when I just saw it, when you like see how emotional she got in that live stream and how close she is to this show.
Oh, I'm really glad you said that, because she is amazing. You know, she was a clear up and comer when you look at her roles before Witch from Mercury, but this is like just a different level, and she is tremendous in it. She is extremely funny, like to the degree I don't think there's any other like Gundam lead that has made me laugh as much as Suletta, but she can turn that on such a dime into really affecting dramatic material. And you know, as I said, I think the writing of the show has a very clear philosophy that its entire worldview kind of extends from who Suletta is as a character, and I think the whole show plays on that with her performance as well. It's a real linchpin of the series, and she is fantastic. This is going to be a star-making role for her, obviously, and for good reason. She's tremendous.
Yeah, and then I'm very excited that they have not stopped that the radio show yet. They're continuing to do that. I haven't had an opportunity to listen to the one that was posted this morning of our recording, but I know that Mamiko Noto, who plays Prospera, she's on it. The last time she was on it was so good. I'm very excited to hear that. And I know they've got like a bunch of guest stars lined up for other people who hadn't been on it before. So I'm very happy that at least my Sunday ritual of Witch from Mercury stuff, I don't have an episode of the show, but I still get an episode of their podcast that I get to listen to while I do my Genshin dailies. And that makes me a happy camper.
If I were Mamiko Noto, I don't think I could resist doing that appearance on the radio show in character as Prospera, just to fuck with everyone on the show. I think it would be great.
Oh my God!
What a performance that is!
Yeah, she had on that live stream. She was one of the people who couldn't be there in person, but she hand wrote a like 3-page long letter talking about like her perspective on the show and like how much she loved it and the themes and all of that. Like she clearly like loves this role. And Mami Konoda is like a big voice actress. We've talked about her on Japanimation Station with Kata no Kyokai, which she plays. Bringing the character's name, but the girl that has like the twisting powers in the third Kata no Kyokai movie. She's in like a bunch of stuff. She's just great, and it's like cool to see how much, you know, she's a mom in real life too. And I think like she like I think really poured a lot into playing this character because it's such a juicy role. It's such a complicated character. Like that's by far the most complicated character to play on the show. There's so much that goes into it, and like I'm pretty sure that clip of Ichino Sakana reads the letter that she wrote on that live stream. I'm pretty sure that has been translated in English, so people can seek that out because it's very cool and it's very touching. And it's like it's the most mom thing to do in the world is to hand write a letter to send in rather than like an email.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, my final thought for this episode. We had, at the end of our year 3, our official rankings of all the series. Do you want to try to put Witch from Mercury in there, or do you want to wait because it's too fresh?
let's do it. You said it, so we got to do it now.
Okay, the document, Sean, is Weekly Suit Gundam 3-year anniversary podcast.
Right.
And if you scroll down a couple pages, I think it's on page 5 here, you will find the official rankings. We have 34 series here, from G Savior at the very bottom to the original Gundam 79 at the very top. Yeah. Do you have a thought of where this will go?
I mean, just want to mention, that it is, it is entirely possible that there will be more Witch from Mercury stuff as well. That I'm very curious to hear if they're going to have this show in August. That's a big live show to celebrate the Witch from Mercury stuff. I'm curious to see if they're going to announce at least a compilation movie thing. I would honestly be shocked if they did not do a movie version of this, whether that's a sequel or a compilation. But so this will be very fresh rankings that could move. My instinct. So I'm looking at our top 10 here. In our top 10, we go Double Zeta, War in the Pocket, Iron Blooded Orphans, Build Fighter, Gundam 00. I think I'm looking at somewhere in these three, Gundam 00, Build Fighters, and Iron Blooded Orphans. I feel like somewhere around Iron Blooded Orphans is where I would put Witch from Mercury.
I don't think it would break the top 10 for me, but I'm okay with it breaking it for us. I would put it under Iron Blood. I would put it under War in the Pocket as well, but I would be okay putting it between War in the Pocket and Iron Blooded Orphans, given your extra level of passion for it.
Yes, because this was it's a shorter Gundam, but it's the longest Gundam in terms of how long we've spent talking about it on podcast, because we've done 2 3-hour podcasts breaking it down. Yeah, I like that placing, putting it one below Iron Blooded Orphans, which unfortunately bumps Double Zeta outside of our top 10, but it's number.
We have a lot of Tomino in the top 10. It's okay.
Yes.
This Double Zeta has a lot of great stuff. I will say Witch from Mercury doesn't have anything as bad as the Moon arc. So there's that. Yeah.
And and it's if you put for my evil Gundam moms, if you put Haman Karn and Prospera in direct competition, I don't know where I would go on that. It's I love both of them so much as evil Gundam moms.
Depends on what you want from your evil Gundam mom. Haman Karn is pure to the attraction of, she is evil and she will, discipline you mercilessly. Yep. Prospera does have good in there deeper. So it depends on what you want from your Gundam mom.
Yeah, if you want that, little spark of hope, buried deep underneath all the cynicism and darkness.
This is, I'm good with this compromise because it keeps War in the Pocket in the top 10 for me, which it needs to be. And then Witch from Mercury is there. I do think, in the spin-offs, 00, Iron Blooded Orphans, Witch from Mercury, I do think broadly it is on that level. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I would definitely say that, it being right about Iron Blooded Orphans in quality is where I would put it. And again, it's it's so fresh that it's hard to make that ranking feel very definitive. But
right. And there could be more, and who knows? There's other provisional stuff we have on here, like Hathaway's Flash is going to almost certainly rise into the top 10 once that's done, but for now it's not. So we'll see.
Yeah, so ranking this stuff is complicated, but boy howdy, Witch from Mercury is very good. And if, people thought, well, it's a short show, it's it must be a lot thinner than other Gundams, not according to the amount of time we spent talking about it on podcasts, because this one is a full-ass length Weekly Suit Gundam. 君は生き延びることができるか?